Welcome back to the final session of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship's 2021 annual conference, taking place this year via Zoom. My name is Don Rubin. I have the honor of being conference chair this year, and I'm hosting this session from my home just north of Toronto. So welcome to Canada. During this session, we will be hearing three papers showing winners of this year's 3-minute video contest, listening in on a panel discussion looking at the authorship claims of Thomas North in comparison to those of Edward de Vere. And in the closing minutes, we'll be hearing about the recipients of 2 SOF honors, the Tom Regnier Veritas Award for Lifetime Contributions to Oxfordianism, and this year's Oxfordian of the Year. For those who are joining us for the first time, the SOF is a not-for-profit organization based in the United States, dedicated to academic study and public outreach concerning the Shakespeare authorship question generally, and more specifically, our belief that the works were written in whole or great measure by Edward de Vere. We offer research grants to this end, publish an annual journal of our findings, the Oxfordian, issue regular newsletters, support a podcast series called Don't Quill the Messenger, host an annual video contest on the subject, and hold conferences and symposia like this one. If this sounds good to you and you're not already a member, please join the SOF. It's not expensive. And it's important to show the world that there's a lot of us who doubt the traditional attribution of Shakespeare's works to the man from Stratford. We need to show our support for the hundreds of teachers and professors, maybe it's thousands, who are hesitant to speak about the authorship question for fear of academic retribution. Join us and join them in standing up for independent, fact-based scholarship. And if you're already a member, please think about making a financial donation to support our many activities. You'll find us at ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. And I assure you that the donation button will be pretty easy to find. Now, on to the program. Our first speaker has been a professor of English at Washington State University for more than 30 years, offering courses on Shakespeare, Chaucer, and popular culture. He's been awarded grants to research de Vere's travels in Italy. He's a regular presenter at SOF conferences, and he is also an outstanding pianist. His paper today is entitled Epiphanies, whilst editing an Oxfordian edition of Twelfth Night. I give you Professor Michael Delahoyde.
Okay. Y'all seeing this and hearing me?
Yes.
More importantly, do I look good? And I got a doctor's appointment on Thursday. I don't want to go on the blood pressure medication, so I'm on intermittent fasting. Anyway, speaking of irrelevancies, Twelfth Night. What on earth does this have to do with anything? Twelfth Night is the 12th day of Christmas. It's, with the partridge and the pear tree and all of that. But it's been a puzzle about why this title has anything to do with the play. It would be nice if you took the term Twelfth Night, Three Kings Day, Little Christmas, it's called some places, Epiphany. Unfortunately, the idea of Epiphany is an anachronism. It's a later notion. I always say you need an epiphany to figure out what on earth this play is about. And all along, it's been declared not at all connected to the title. Bloom says that he's sorry that Twelfth Night is the title. What You Will, the subtitle, would be better. I don't know where Isaac Asimov gets this notion that a lawyers' guild seems to have commissioned Shakespeare in 1600 to write an amusing play for Twelfth Night, and he did so, and the play was called Twelfth Night. That doesn't make any sense. And yeah, so a duke visited Elizabeth's court in 1601, but if your name was Orsino and you were being presented as Orsino in this play, fooled by a guy playing a girl playing a guy, would that be flattering to you? Is that a good idea? And besides, you don't name a play after a particular event or day. So, I'm not going to tell you to join my new series on NBC. It's called May 13th at 6:24 p.m. Because yeah, okay, I know about Saturday Night Live, but that's every Saturday night except when they're off. So something's goofy there. What the desperate need to do is to say, oh, well, Twelfth Night, it's like the Christmas season, a reference to the topsy-turvyism and the fun and all the games and fun that we're having. It's just a meaningless festival of joy. And then we'd have a Lord of Misrule. We'd get some kind of deformed, pathetic beggar on the street, and we'd put a crown on his head, and we'd all be drunk and think this was hilarious. It's like a 16th century frat party. But the other problem is that there's nothing intrinsic in this play that has to do with that Christmas season. In fact, there are references to May or midsummer, which need not have anything to do with the setting of the play. But if you actually, in the rare occasion when you see the play set in the Christmas season or in the dead of winter, kind of craps up the comedy of it too. It's just such a drag. And as for the 1601 notion or 1602, here's a problem. There's a sketch in 1596 that looks like a scene from Twelfth Night at the Swan Theater. And then there are all these references that are topical much earlier on, early 1580s, like the Brownists, a Protestant sect who became basically the pilgrims who came to this country. Thank you so much, say the turkeys and the Indians. Also, there's references to boats that are sailing in Elizabethan rivers in the 1580s. But a better explanation for the title is Twelfth Night, to think of it as the end of the Christmas season. And if music be the food of love, play on is the celebratory first line of the play. You take it out of context and it sounds great. But you take it in context and you realize that what Orsino is asking for is just give me more, give me excess of it, that surfeit, the appetite may sicken and so die. He wants so much love that he doesn't want love anymore. He wants so much, food that he vomits. He wants so much drink that he's drunk, and you never want that stuff again. It's why I can't drink white wine to this very day. That theme of excess makes sense in the play. So you've got Feste not serving really as a jester, but being asked, what's a drunken man like? Set him up. Like a drowned man, a fool, and a madman. One draft above heat makes him a fool, the second mads him, and the third drowns him. So excess in drink applies to Sir Toby, but excess in every other way. Is this what's wrong with all these people in Illyria? Is this what Shakespeare is trying to tell us is thematically relevant here? My favorite critic, Harold Goddard, says this is Shakespeare's farewell to comedy. After this play, you get just things that aren't funny, like Merchant of Venice, or the problem plays that are a problem because they don't seem to classify as comedy. It seems like Shakespeare starts, to me, to question comedy at this point. And even in this play, at a midpoint, you can have laughs up to the cross garters and yellow stockings, but once the dark room comes into place, it seems like it went too far. It seems like even Toby is willing to say, yeah, enough is enough here. So for the end of the Christmas season, when we got to get back to real life, that would work for Twelfth Night, but it's not enough. And I want to push beyond that. So I can flip through, and I know you're going to say too much, too fast, about the traditional Oxfordian explanation of Twelfth Night and the identification of characters, the connection to the Italian source. And Rima Greenhill is on to the possibility of Oxford having traveled to the relevant Serbian coast, Ragusa, Dalmatia at the time. But first, where is Oxford in this play? First, he is with Orsino, who says, I am myself best when least in company, which is, a snazzy notion when you're supposed to be courting a woman and decide to send somebody else to do it for you so you can lounge on the couch and be alone. But of course, it matches up when Oxford, in his E.O. poem, says, I am never less idle low than when I am alone. And boy, was that right. It's said of Orsino, he's far more in love with language, music, and love and himself than he is with Olivia, which might be Oxford. But this is really interesting. He has Olivia, his intended love interest, say this about him, Orsino, but Oxford, I suppose him virtuous, I know him noble, of great estate, of fresh and stainless youth, voices well divulged, free, learned, and valiant in dimension and the shape of nature, a gracious person. Amen. I agree. And when in voices well divulged, the note is always well spoken of. Other people, many voices say he's great. I wonder, can that also mean that he's a really good ventriloquist? He has many voices. He can speak through many characters. Well, if Orsino is interested in a woman, Olivia, Elizabeth is a good candidate here. And the constant reminder, hey, pay attention to him, seems to be at the source of one of the two branches of this play. Olivia lapses into the royal we, which she shouldn't do. She's associated with the red and white Tudor colors, and she's called princess. Elizabeth liked to be called prince. Countess, that's not especially relevant. And there's all this royal language constantly around her. Don't usurp yourself, for what is yours to bestow is not yours to reserve. You should love, Orsino. Lady, you are the cruelest she alive, if you would lead these graces to the grave and leave no world, no copy. This is the sonnet's message, which seems absolutely inappropriate in every possible context, except for one, for us, where she's not just supposed to listen to Orsino's love protests, but immediately be a breeder too. She's a marble-breasted tyrant when she doesn't agree to anything. And other characters. I was glad this morning that we heard about Peregrine Bertie, Lord Willoughby, with the T of Bert and the Willoughby maybe making Toby as the character Toby, Sir Toby. And also Maria as his eventual wife too, as Oxford's sister. That makes a lot of sense for reasons that were explained this morning. I especially like Sir Philip Sidney being mocked because this guy gets on my wick. He's a fool and a quarreler and a coward. And the prudent would think that we would quickly have the gift of a grave because he's such an upstart. Well, the gift of a grave is a reference to the E.O. poem by Oxford, where he wonders, I wonder if I were a king, would I be happy? If I were unknown, would I be happier? If I were dead, would I not have so much suffering? I don't know what, a kingdom, a cottage, or a grave. Then Flippy Sidney thought he was so clever in thinking, oh, well, I wish you did have a grave at the end. So Sir Andrew is the exquisite idiot, but he's not just a regular idiot. He's got particular qualities to make him an idiot. He's supposed to be adept at languages, and he doesn't even know Miss Piggy language like French pourquoi, do or not do. And it's not just that he doesn't know it, it's that he thinks anything he doesn't know is a command to him, do it or not do it, in imperative mode. That's a special brand of stupid. I'm a fellow with the strangest mind in the world. I delight in masque and revel, sometimes altogether. I give my students on the first day of the semester a questionnaire, and I ask them, what is your special expertise? And some of them will say, I like to spend time with my friends. Okay. Others will say, I like to have fun. I just asked you, what is it that is fun for you? Well, the same with this moron. It's weird. I'm like so unusual. I like to have fun. And I'm an eater of beef, but that's the vegetarian Oxford that we can't have time to go into today. Sir Andrew is taunted into issuing a challenge to his rival for Olivia, which is Cesario, the disguised Viola. And he comes up with a letter that's a challenge. And we all know that Flippy Sidney came up with a challenge to Oxford about the tennis court incident where he was called a puppy. So in the play, oh, look, this is an edition of Twelfth Night. It's not available yet, within days. And I believe that you will be notified when this is available. This is the latest thing. Twelfth Night by Shakespeare, turns out. Here's the challenge. Youth, whatsoever thou that art but a scurvy fellow. Wonder not, nor admire not in thy mind why I call thee so, for I will show thee no reason for it. Thou comest to the Lady Olivia, and in my sight she uses thee kindly. Damn you, or something. But thou liest in thy throat. I didn't even say anything. That is not the matter that I challenge thee for. Oh, okay. So what's the point here? I will waylay thee going home. So you ambush me from behind a bush, where if it be thy chance to kill me, thou killest me like a rogue and a villain. Well, who's the rogue and the villain? Ambiguity there. Fare thee well. Okay, good luck till then. And God have mercy upon one of our souls. He may have mercy upon mine, but my hope is better. And so look to thyself, thy friend as thou usest it, thy friend, your pal Andrew, and thy sworn enemy too, by the way. Well, here's what Flippy Sidney actually wrote to somebody else that he issued a challenge to because he seemed like he couldn't help himself. You have played the very knave with me, and so I will make you know if I have good proof of it. But that for so much as is past. For that is to come, I will thrust my dagger into you, for I speak in earnest. In the meantime, bye-bye. Hope things are going well. So he deserves what he gets, this ass head and coxcomb and a knave and a thin-faced knave, Flippy Sidney. As for Malvolio, all the connections are there with Christopher Hatton. This has long been established. He's associated with the word sheep and mutton in the play, which are Elizabeth's nicknames for him. He was considered a affected fribble at the court, a dancing chancellor, a big pain in the ass, and arrogant, and he deserved what he got. So Malvolio, as ill will to EO maybe, is Hatton. The unfortunate unhappy, which is the letter signed associated with him, is his poesy at court when he's writing these sappy letters to Elizabeth. And sneck up. Now, Mark Anderson has come up with this delightful, I hope this actually happened, this delightful interpretation of the yellow stockings. Apparently, Henry VIII, whenever he got rid of a wife, this was his celebratory sartorial getup. He wore his yellow stockings, and little Elizabeth would have recognized this perhaps. So if Hatton didn't know about this, and these jokesters like Oxford and his friends actually set him up like this, I so hope that happened. So he trots in front of Elizabeth, and she is aghast. But into weirder matters here that press us further. This reference to the pleasant conceit of Vere, discontented the rising but mean gentleman at court circa 1580, has long been considered a reference to the earlier version of Twelfth Night. I like what Catherine Chilton has to say about court entertainments not being long enough for full plays being joined together. And Twelfth Night sure seems to be like two different plot lines woven together, but you could untangle them too. You know, it's a good job, but they are two separate stories, basically. Is this just the one? But my question that's never seemed to have been asked is, if this is the case, why hasn't this ever been recognized as an earlier source or version of Twelfth Night? And it's got to be because it was so different from what we have that it would be unrecognizable, which is typical Shakespeare revision, as Ramon Yenemes has constantly been showing us. Christian Smid has come up with 4 books of what he calls unconformities. Basically, it's the evidence internally and textually of revision in the Shakespeare plays. And once you think, okay, has this been revised and tampered with afterwards? You think Sir Toby Belch and Sir Andrew Aguecheek, is that really Shakespeare? Toby and Andrew, maybe. Toby, because of what I said before. Andrew, well, Flippy Sidney was born on St. Andrew's Day. But Toby Belch, that sounds to me like a later 17th century satire, over-the-top designation. Then there's this moment where Malvolio, who's supposed to be having puritanical leanings, nevertheless invokes Jove. Is that because King James put into play this notion that you would be charged enormously if you use the word God or Jesus or something on the stage? It's not consistent throughout the play, but it seems like there's this moment of tampering. More damning is the notion of Viola washing ashore and wondering, what am I going to do here? And she says she's going to present herself as a eunuch because she can sing. That's going to be her role in this play. And what happens? It becomes Feste's role. Orsino calls for music. Give me some music now, good friends, Mar. Now, good Cesario, but that piece of song, that old and antique song we heard last night, methought it did relieve my passion much, more than light airs and recollected terms of these most brisk and giddy paced times. Come, but one verse. He's speaking in verse, calling for Cesario to repeat a song we heard last night, a brisk song and giddy. And then there's this prose interruption by a servant. He is not here, so please your lordship, that should sing it. Who was it? Feste the jester, my lord, a fool that Lady Olivia's father took much delight in. Well, this is patched in, as it were. Feste now is mentioned for the only time in the entire play by name. Otherwise, he's clown. And what is he doing there? He's a Lady Olivia's father's jester, I suppose. But he's been patched in and he's taken over the original intention of giving Viola the songs. And the songs are not clownish. They're pretty grim. And you got this superfluous character, Fabian. You got the three revelers getting in trouble from Malvolio and taking their revenge, but Feste's gone. And Fabian is there, left over from an earlier version, I would presume. There's no slander in a loud fool, though he do nothing but rail. This new Oxford character placed into the play is an allowed fool, like Oxford was, allowed to satirize people and get away with all kinds of things, murder, in fact, though he do nothing but rail. Feste never rails in the play, but Oxford was known, it's on the record, he never stopped railing against people. And I think Shakespeare raised this to an art form that stand-up comedians are still using these days, and so many other characters in the plays are railers. But that's an indication that you've got Oxford as a character in the play. Inappropriately in this one, he's not a railer, but he's appreciated. There's a Chaucer connection, but here's where I want to go. MOAI is repeated in this play. It's a little bunch of initials that are supposed to drive Malvolio crazy. And if you look at the first folio, no man must know, he reads, no man must know. This is a big secret. No man must know. MOAO, MOAO, MOAI, MOAI. Behind the bushes, Fabian says, cool. A nonsense riddle that's going to drive him nuts. And Sir Toby says, excellent wench, say I, referring to Maria, who came up with this. And most people think he's confirming what Fabian says. I think he's rejecting it. I think Fabian says, oh, cool, a nonsense riddle. And Sir Toby says, nah, it's a brilliant thing. And she is brilliant. She came up with this. So it's not nonsense. And can Shakespeare constitutionally even do nonsense? In the first folio, there are these apparent mistakes. Now, I think we should have listened to Alan Green 15 years ago. And I think we should again, because it gets us into this new thing, esoterica, and these supposed mistakes in the first folio, but come on. So in Twelfth Night, you've got pages 262, 263, 264, and suddenly something's wacky. At the top of 264, the number's altered, and it is altered. But also, you've got alter D. And if some of you remember the presentation long, long ago, the alter is relevant, and D, Sir John D, is relevant. But for right now, we're missing page 265. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, which has connections to this play, that no time to go into that too, you got 151, 152. Wait, what? 154, 155. Missing page is 153. Those two together are the square root of 3, which in sacred geometry, sacred mathematics is the square root of 3. Therefore, it has to do with the Trinity. But it's also, you might have run into this term, the vesica, the ratio that is the vesica Pisces or Piscis. This is in sacred geometry, the intersection of two circles whose centers are points on the outsides of the other circles, and which in that mathematics creates a kind of that Christian symbol of the fish. And this has been used as sacred female space. This has been used in church art for centuries, and even the Vatican is based architecturally on this principle. It is sacred mathematics, sacred geometry, and Shakespeare knows about this stuff. This is new. Then take MOAI. Well, what is that? I used to dismiss one notion that somebody had said, these are the symbols for the four elements, MOAI. And I thought, well, yeah, peachy, big deal. But what's that supposed to mean? Now I realize, wait a minute, elements is a notion in the play. Feste says it's overused. Malvolio says, I am not of your element. That means I am not part of you. I am not one with you. And he's wrong about that. We are all together now. He's obstructed. He doesn't recognize his name as one of the near anagrams to other names in the play because he's got that mal in front of him. And then the letter also says, as the fall into thy hand revolve. And no one knows what to do with this because, you know, should we just turn around? If you revolve MOAI, it's IAOM. And Alan Green has determined that this is basically the Western cultural version of the Om, the sacred reverberance of the God sound. This is the letters that would be revealed to you if you were a Rosicrucian or Freemason when you got to the 33rd level of revelation, that this is the sacred term. And John Dee is involved in all of this. Now, what should I do in Illyria ends up being Viola's job to act as a go-between between Orsino and Olivia. And there's often theatrical language involved in that. Ultimately, Olivia gets involved in this secret marriage. And based on this play, not enough time really now left to go into it, but I wonder, was there a secret marriage? It didn't have to be revealed, but if Elizabeth wanted a secret marriage and Oxford and she exchanged rings, because she does disappear with him with the Archbishop of Canterbury, I think, who's the only guy who can marry royalty a couple times in the key years, then wouldn't she say, yeah, okay, we're married, but this has to be a secret for now because, you know, Philip of Spain and the international politics and the Catholics and Protestants, blah, 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 blah. But really, just for now, it's a secret. Then you got this go-between, Cesario, meaning little king. What I am and what I would are as secret as Maidenhead, this figure says to Olivia Elizabeth, to your ears divinity, Virgin Queen, to any other's profanation. If others knew that the Virgin Queen had actually had sex or a kid. And then this go-between between Oxford and Elizabeth is asked, parentage above my fortunes, yet my state is well, which that guy might have said. He's connected to the fivefold blazon, which is Oxfordian. The song says, in delay to Elizabeth, there lies no plenty. Why are you waiting? Youth's a stuff will not endure. And after those first lines, you hear about violets, viola, pensée in French, to think, or forget-me-nots, the purple flower at the Venus and Adonis ending. In Midsummer Night's Dream, you've got a purple flower here, love and idleness connected with Elizabeth. Again and again, these forget-me-nots is the go-between for Oxford to Elizabeth. Do not forget me. Maybe that's Oxford. But, and I don't want to do this because I've been accused and, you know, sabotaged as a Prince Tudor person. But here's the androgynous Southampton saying, I am not what I am, I am not what I seem. And in the play, I can't make my actual knowledge, my estate known, not who I am exactly. The term misprision, the lowered degree of Southampton's sentence, is mentioned in the play. There's something that people sense about the play, Stratfordians or anybody who senses about the play at the end, that is sad or lost. Last math here today. You keep getting threes. Have you never seen the picture of we three? Feste says to these guys, these revelers, referring to this idea that's clever and a joke about jackasses. Wait a minute, there's only two. Hey, I got that. You're involved in the art. And this enigmatic stuff about the bells, 1, 2, 3, that Feste says, well, 12th night, 1 and 2 is 3, but there's a triangle, I guess, in it. There's also, though, mention of wise men a lot. And that's a standard trope, fools and the wise. But 12th night, that is not the birth of the new king. It is the acknowledgement of the world leaders of the new king. Olivia's called Madonna a couple times. And I wonder, so, all right, Elizabeth, you're going to be the Virgin Queen. You're taking over for the Virgin Mary. Now we're Protestant. That's peachy. Who's Jesus? As my sacred father used to say, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. You got a 3 here, a trinity of sorts. Is it that Oxford said, hey, so acknowledge the rest of the equation here. And I am, wait a minute, Joseph, or am I the father? No, he wouldn't go that far, would he? To think like he's God and the Virgin Mary and the new king. Well, I am that I am is a revelation of the sacred name that he's feeling like he should use. And you could get in trouble. This is blasphemous. I mean, Jesus. Anyway, I don't know what to say about all this and the ending and the sense of it about renounced possibilities that have been lost. But that's the tone that you get at the end of this play, and that grim song at the end about the wind and the rain. More importantly, though, if there is consolation in this, it's this throwaway phrase, like all these throwaway titles that he keeps using. It's all one. Doesn't matter, whatever. It's all the same thing. That's all one. But I do think that Oxford is in touch with the esoteric and the spiritual notions of oneness. Malvolio's not. And if there's any consolation that he gets at the end, it's that it's all one. It really is. I get it. Now, if I may be able to, in the last, 2 minutes, right, to say something, it is that I was really glad that Tom Regnier, I keep forgetting about this, that he quotes me from about getting creativity wrong, which I got from Charles Beauclerk initially, saying you get the Elizabethan age wrong if you get Shakespeare wrong. But I thought worse than that, you get creativity wrong. That is to say, you are being robbed of the notion that you have a talent that is sacred and it's yours, and it's like a fire in you. You don't need food, you don't need sleep, you just are on fire when you're doing this. And to be told that, no, you just pop out of the womb and you're a genius and you can do it, makes you think, okay, well, I'm no Shakespeare, so I can't write, so I'm going to rely on spell check. I'm not the son of God, I'm not Jesus, so I don't have to be nice to people or anything like that. But that's a lie, and it's an abomination. You have this fire, and you need to recognize where that comes from. That is the authentic you, and you need to be just letting it go and recognizing that's what that's what the inspiration of Oxford as Shakespeare is. And by the way, don't tell me that you didn't pop out of the womb being a great editor because it's those scholars. Because, I saw that the Scarecrow got this thing out of a bag and, suddenly he has a brain. No, you could be an editor of an Oxfordian edition of a play. All you need is dedication, which you got because you're here, and a belief in this, and a recognition that we could do anything, and a little bit of OCD. So this is a bit premature of me, but I just want to say that these Oxfordian editions, I am on fire about these things. I'm addicted to it. And 12th night, as I say, should be out soon. You'll hear about it. And on we go. Come with me, because we're all one.
Thank you, Michael. Terrific presentation, great insights, and some most impressive epiphanies. There are a couple of questions. We'll send them to you afterwards. Really appreciate it. Our next speaker is a physician and clinical psychologist at Georgetown University and the author of more than 200 publications, including more than 100 on Shakespeare. His most recent ebook is called It's Time to Revere the Works of William Shakespeare. A psychoanalyst reads the works of Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. His paper argues and is titled Oxford Translated Boccaccio's Decameron. I pass the Zoom lens to Richard M. Waugaman. Rick.
Thank you, Don. I'm grateful to the organizing committee for inviting me to speak. I also want to thank Gary Goldstein for helping me strengthen the article on which this presentation is based. Now, last year marked the 400th anniversary of the first English translation of Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, a book set in Florence in 1348 during Europe's Black Death, the deadliest plague in human history. It may have killed 3/4 of the population of Florence. So it is timely to take a fresh look at that influential but anonymous translation. First, let's recall that the year after Oxford's father died in 1562, and he began living with Sir William Cecil, London experienced an epidemic that killed as many as 25% of its inhabitants. Once again, in the years 1585 to 87, England suffered another outbreak of plague, which may have reminded Oxford of those earlier times. Just as today, while we try to survive the COVID-19 pandemic, we feel a special kinship with books about plagues and pandemics, Oxford would likely have had similar feelings about Boccaccio's collection of stories. Decameron was long controversial. Boccaccio is remembered to this day in the Italian word boccaccesco, meaning licentious. Why was the book so controversial? For centuries, Boccaccio had been widely respected for his scholarly works in Latin and was regarded as a great moralist, advocating that obligations to one's city and country be put above self-interest. Not a bad idea. Eventually, though, the salacious and fiercely anti-clerical content of Decameron overshadowed his earlier reputation. In fact, the book was entered into the Catholic Church's first Counter-Reformation Index of banned books in 1559. This made it a bestseller. In 1582, Leonardo Salviati published a new Baudelarized translation that returned Decameron into the Church's good graces through deleting its more offensive material. In Salviati's version, more than half of the 100 stories were significantly altered from Boccaccio's original text. One can imagine the tension between the fame of this book on the one hand and its power to offend the Church with its relentless anti-clericalism. Although Boccaccio's Decameron was translated into several languages by 1500, its first full English translation only appeared anonymously in 1620. However, the printer John Wolfe entered a version of the book into the Stationer's Register in 1587. Converging evidence that I will be presenting leads me to infer this was the translation that was not published until 1620. Herbert Wright has shown that the Italian source text for the 1620 translation was Salviati's heavily censored Italian edition, first published in 1582, which is consistent with the English translation then being registered 5 years later. The 1620 edition was published by Isaac Jaggard in 2 lavish folio volumes with dozens of woodcut illustrations. Further, it was dedicated to Philip Herbert, Earl of Montgomery, one of the 2 dedicatees of Shakespeare's first folio, published by Isaac Jaggard 3 years later in 1623. One theory is that the 1620 work was Jaggard's dry run for Shakespeare's first folio. Guida Armstrong states that an anonymous translation was unusual by 1620. So a word about early modern anonymous publication. Marcy North, who has done seminal work on this topic, warns us that we suffer from some unscholarly prejudices about anonymous works. For example, quote, scholars have traditionally preferred works with known authors, and anonymous works are assumed to be far inferior to those of known authors. One cannot help but thinking of a parallel with the stigma of illegitimate birth. North concludes that scholars dislike an authorship vacuum, and that once it is filled with a speculative attribution, scholars may move on without closely re-examining the accuracy of that initial authorship attribution. She cites the traditional attribution of the art of English poesy to George Putnam as an example. The history of the attribution of the 1620 Decameron translation to John Florio illustrates this problem. Herbert Wright, the first to make this tentative attribution in his 1953 book, admitted he was uncertain, but in the years since, it is often treated as established fact, hanging on to the translation like barnacles. So we may meet resistance when we challenge such a possibly flawed but traditional authorship assumption. Herbert Wright deserves to be better known. Nearly 2 decades before his 1953 book attributing the 1620 translation to Florio, Wright published a book on early English versions of selected tales from Decameron. Wright was a scholar of profound erudition and deep familiarity with many of the early editions of Antoine Le Maçon's French translation of the book, as well as with many early editions of Salviati's expurgated Italian translation. Armstrong observes that, quote, it was then typical practice to check the translated text against versions in different languages. Wright also was intimately familiar with Florio's 1603 translation of Montaigne's essays. So much so that one wonders about a possible role of confirmation bias as he developed his profile of salient characteristics of the anonymous 1620 translator. Douglas Bush is ambivalent about Wright's attribution of the translation to Florio, wondering if Wright developed his list of parallel characteristics in the anonymous translator and in Florio because he had already chosen Florio. If so, this would illustrate the cognitive hazard of confirmation bias when we unconsciously pay more attention to evidence that supports our pre-existing assumptions. Bush gives the example of Florio's translation of Montaigne being moralistic, but he does not find an equivalently moralistic strain in the Boccaccio translation. Armstrong writes that other scholars, quote, are skeptical about this attribution to Florio, claiming that there is insufficient evidence. Armstrong's comments on the 1620 translation weaken Wright's attribution of it to John Florio in several ways, opening up the possibility of a different translator. Armstrong observes, quote, the 1620 edition is unusual among Boccaccio's works in English translation in that there is absolutely no indication of the identity of the translator. Boccaccio is not named on the title page or indeed anywhere in this book. There have been no other anonymous works attributed to Florio. The attribution to Florio, quote, remains problematic. Armstrong also notes the paradox that Florio would have concealed his role in translating this book while he took credit for his highly regarded translation of Montaigne's essays. Melissa Walter concludes that Shakespeare could read Italian and speculates that, quote, Shakespeare could also have read Decameron in French, possibly alongside Italian. That is precisely the two versions that scholars have concluded the anonymous translator of the 1620 edition used. Now, Oxford and Decameron in historical context. We know Decameron influenced some of the plays of Oxford. Wright speaks of, quote, the problem of Shakespeare's knowledge of Boccaccio, meaning how was he familiar with tales in Decameron that had not yet been translated into English, and then used them in plays such as Cymbeline. I will present evidence that Oxford did the translation, which would highlight just how important Decameron was to him. Oxford's interest in Italy, in translations in general, in personally financing translations of works by Italian authors, Cardenas Comfort, the Book of the Courtier, and in literary translations are all consistent with his having undertaken this translation. Most notably, the translator's use of anonymity is fully consistent with Oxford's pattern of concealing his authorship of the vast majority of his works. The 1620 translation had difficulties with the legal authorities. The Bishop of London gave his approval for the book's publication, only to be overruled by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Ultimately, though, the book did find its way into print in 1620. The translation appeared in 4 further editions by 1684, attesting to its popularity. I think it is likely that, whether or not he collaborated on the 1587 version of this translation, it was Anthony Munday who toned it down enough to overcome the objections of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, it may seem surprising that so many years elapsed between Oxford's translation of this work by 1587 and its publication some 33 years later. But recall that As You Like It, for example, was first entered into the Stationer's Register in 1600, yet was not published for 23 years. Of course, half the plays in the first folio were written by the time of Oxford's death in 1604, but remained unpublished until 1623. Decameron, being published in 1620 by Jaggard, with a dedication to Philip Herbert, may be related to the circumstances that led the first folio to be published in 1623 by the same publisher, and with Herbert and his noble brother as dedicatees. Herbert's wife was Oxford's daughter, Susan Vere, and she may well have been the owner of the manuscript of this translation. What else may have appealed to Oxford about translating this work? We know that Oxford devoted much of his life and his career to establishing English as a respected literary language at a time when few Europeans knew English. Given his interests, he knew that just as Dante and Petrarch made Italian as respectable as Latin for poetry, so Boccaccio did the same for Italian for works of prose. Ovid was one of Oxford's models for poetry. Boccaccio may have been such a model for literary prose. For Oxford, translations were an important means of making foreign texts widely accessible to English readers, honing his writing skills, and enriching the English language in the process. Oxford, of course, was a pivotal figure in the creation of English literature. A 2021 book titled How Literatures Begin, A Global History concludes that, quote, very strikingly, the beginnings of literatures are regularly venues for the transformative impact of interstitial figures, bilingual or trilingual intercultural actors who become the catalysts for new forms of cultural expression. These individuals are often able to import into the target culture their expertise in an outside literary tradition. Again, this helps us understand Oxford's interest in translating Latin classics, such as Ovid's Metamorphoses, as well as the Italian Decameron. Now, attributes of the translator. A review of Wright's 1953 book by Douglas Bush states, quote, the translator, like Elizabethan translators in general, and more than most of them, gave free rein to his own personal and stylistic idiosyncrasies. Further, in general, he is exuberantly, not to say intemperately, word conscious. Let me now list the characteristics Wright found in the anonymous translator. Quote, in addition to his competence in both French and Italian, he manifests a special interest in dogs and horses, the sea, the law, drama, fine arts and music, a courtly relish for ceremony and rank. While many of these qualities do indeed describe Oxford, Bush does not agree with Wright that they describe Florio. It is instructive that Wright's methodology for identifying an unknown author resembles J. Thomas Looney's earlier method for identifying Oxford as Shakespeare. In fact, let's compare Wright's findings with Looney's relevant characteristics of the author of Shakespeare's works. So first Wright, and then I'll add in a different tone of voice, Looney. The translator, more than most Elizabethan translators, gave free rein to his own personal and stylistic idiosyncrasies, Looney. The author of Shakespeare's works was eccentric and mysterious, unconventional. Wright, in addition to his competence in both French and Italian, Looney, an enthusiast for Italy. Wright, the translator manifests a special interest in dogs and horses, Looney, a follower of sport. Wright, the sea, the law, drama, Looney, an enthusiast in the world of drama. Wright, in fine arts and music, Looney, a lover of music. Wright, a courtly relish for ceremony and rank, Looney, a member of the higher aristocracy, and then the rest is right. He heightens emotional effects through vivid phrasing and dramatic particularity. The anonymous translator's style reveals a concern for rhythm and balance, for alliteration in a score of various forms, including doublets and triplets and compound adjectives, and for repetition of words. I'll be returning to these stylistic characteristics later. Now, what of the anonymous dedicatory epistle to Oxford's son-in-law, the Earl of Montgomery? Oxford, of course, died in 1604. The dedication was most likely written by Oxford's literary secretary, Anthony Munday. The translation's dedication contains the phrase foul-mouthed slander and detraction, which also appears word for word in the dedication of Munday's signed 1618 work, Sidero Threambos. Even the context is comparable. The 1620 anonymous dedication asserts that the book, with Herbert as patron, will, quote, be safely shielded from foul-mouthed slander and detraction. Similarly, Munday's signed 1618 dedication asks the patron to be, quote, protector from foul-mouthed slander and detraction. And these are the only two works in early English books online that contain that phrase. Munday also dedicated his 1618 translation of books 3 and 4 of the Modus of Gaul to the Earl of Montgomery, with wording that, as Armstrong observes, is also similar to that of the 1620 translation. It is almost as though Munday used his 1620 anonymous dedication to leave deliberate clues as to his identity. It is conceivable that he collaborated with Oxford in writing the translation. It is said that, quote, in the 1580s and 1590s, particularly, Munday functioned as a major translation factory, translating works into English from French, Italian, and Spanish. What was happening in Oxford's life from the early 1580s, when he may have obtained the new Salviati translation, until 1587, when a new edition of the book was entered into the Stationer's Register? A great deal. Highly relevant was Oxford's purchase of Fisher's Folly in 1580, which Mark Anderson has called, quote, a bohemian retreat for euphuist writers. Euphuism, which scholars acknowledge heavily influenced the style of the 1620 translation, was at its height in the 1580s, then fell out of favor. Oxford was banished from court for 2 years in 1581. In 1586, Queen Elizabeth granted him his £1,000 annuity. We might speculate that Oxford was attracted to Salviati's 1582 edition in part because being exiled from court himself made him identify with the 10 young people in Decameron who were in self-imposed exile from Florence as they recounted their 100 stories. So Oxford may have written the translation in the years following 1582, then decided against publication at the request of Queen Elizabeth, who may have found its racy stories too controversial. Oxford would have been more compliant with her wishes than previously, not wanting to jeopardize his generous annuity from the state. Now, linguistic parallels with Oxford Shakespeare. Wright did much to renew interest in the 1620 translation. He suggested that it led to increased appreciation of Decameron in England. Wright comments that this translation, in contrast with the Italian original, quote, is often marked by an emotional and a dramatic quality, as well as by a partiality for significant detail. This vividness is strengthened by a considerable range of stylistic effects, from the simple and racy to the elaborate and ornate. The translator makes extensive use of balance, and his work has a well-defined rhythm. These unite with a complicated and skillfully devised system of alliteration to leave a deep impression on the ear. Unlike Oxford, Florio wrote no dramas, and Wright's praise sounds far more consistent with the writings of Shakespeare. Donatella Montini characterizes the translator's style as euphuistic. However, as I've said, euphuism flourished during the 1580s, which adds to the evidence that this translation dates back to that decade rather than to the early 17th century. In addition, Oxford was known as the patron of the euphuistic school, further connecting him with this translation. Indeed, his secretary, John Lilly, initiated the euphuistic fashion with his 1579 novel, Euphuist, The Anatomy of Wit, and with his second novel in 1580, Euphuist and His England, both of which featured an Italianized Englishman. Moreover, Lilly dedicated his second Euphuist novel to Oxford. C.S. Lewis has characterized euphuism as, quote, antithesis, alliteration, balance, rhyme, and assonance, all taken to excess. Recall that Wright emphasized the alliteration and balance in the 1620 translation. Here is just one example of its alliteration. The quadruple alliteration of the letter F, followed by, in the same word, by the letter R in the phrase, free from future fear. Significantly, Montini cites a passage in the anonymous 1589 Art of English Poesy as she examines the translator's style. Previously, I've attributed the art to Oxford himself. Montini believes the 1620 translation makes heavy use of what the art calls, quote, the climbing figure of climax, a scheme that presents a mounting over a series of words, clauses, or sentences, close quote. Montini then concludes, the structured principle which shapes the 1620 translation is that of copia, abundance, of increase, of crescendo. In various forms and at different levels, the translator develops a homogeneous, pervasive strategy of addition and expansion. The translator's style presents the usual arsenal of devices typical of euphuism. Equally important is that Oxford extensively used hendiadys, a particular kind of verbal doublet, more than any other Elizabethan writer. Montini extensively explores the translation's use of such doublets. She also links alliteration with such doubling in many cases. She speaks of the translator's, quote, love for alliterations to couple two terms different in meaning and similar in form. I will now note a few parallels with Oxford's other works and word coinages, quirky spellings, and phrases that are also found in Shakespeare. The 1620 translation uses the trope, quote, his hair stood upright like Porcupine's quill. You remember when the ghost in Hamlet says, I could a tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul and make each particular hair to stand on end like quills upon the fretful porcupine. What an image of fright. The OED gives this 1620 translation as the source of 5 newly coined words, hard aching, low hanging, monkey faced, replite, and mocked. If the translation was written by 1587, it coined many other words, such as separatist, insidiator, and virgin man. The translator also coined new meanings for 22 words, including mount, meaning to blush with rage or passion, and 3 Shakespeare plays coined 3 other meanings of mount, and rapture, meaning a strong emotional attack. And Coriolanus is cited as the first example of rapture, meaning a state of passion. The translation speaks of a monk feeling, quote, effeminate temptations toward a kneeling wench. The OED gives meaning 3 of effeminate as, quote, devoted to women. It states that, quote, unequivocal instances are rare, and it gives only 2 such examples, including one from the 1589 Art of English Poesy. We might add Henry IV's description of Prince Hal's low life in the taverns as, quote, wanton and effeminate, and Romeo's complaint that Juliet hath made me effeminate. Decameron's story of Bertrand and Helena is well known to be a source for all's well that ends well. In his translation, Oxford emphasizes a parallel with his own life. The Italian version said, and I'm using English, of course, once the count, that is Bertrand's father, died, he, Bertrand, was left in the hands of the king, okay? But Oxford translates this as, quote, Old Count Isnar dying, young Bertrand fell as a ward to the king, just as Oxford became the first royal ward in Elizabeth's new wardship system after his father died in 1562. Later in the story, the Italian version has the king say to Bertrand, quote, "Beltramo, you are henceforth great and provided," close quote. Once more, Oxford's longer English translation introduces a key autobiographical word, quote, "Noble Count, it is our royal pleasure to discharge your wardship." And this is the only instance of that phrase, discharge your wardship, in Igbo. It is likely that Oxford thus drew attention to a pivotal parallel with his life, not only because he identified with Bertrand, but because he wished at least some readers of his manuscript translation would recognize this parallel. It would lead readers to understand further that Oxford identified with Bertrand's unwillingness to marry the woman he was ordered to marry. In another story, we find the phrase, quote, "There shall we hear the sweet birds sing," recalling that phrase in The Rape of Lucrece, as well as "where late the sweet birds sang" in Sonnet 73, and "the sweet birds, oh, how they sing" in The Winter's Tale. The only other example of sweet birds sing in Igbo before 1620 is in an Ignoto poem in England's Helicon. And many of us agree with Looney that Ignoto was one of Oxford's pen names, further connecting the 1620 work with Oxford. In another tale, Philippa argues to the judge that she never refused to have sex with her husband, but her libido is stronger than his. So she asks the judge, quote, "What should I do with the overplus remaining in mine own power, and whereof he had no need?" She was being accused of adultery, need I add. Overplus here means excess libido. The OED gives the first use of this meaning of overplus as excess in Shakespeare's Sonnet 135. "Thou hast thy will, and will to boot, and will in overplus." Will meaning carnal appetite here. I'm almost done. In Oxford's private letters, he favored double vowels in words that were seldom spelled that way in his time. This translation also favors such spellings, including we, he, and she with double E's. It uses worthy with double O's, which is found in only 3 other works published in 1620, whereas worthy with one O is used 40 times as often. The 1565 to 1667 translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which I have attributed to Oxford, transformed the original Latin to a much longer and even more ribald English poem. Similarly, the 1620 translation is also longer than Boccaccio's original and more salacious than Salviati's Italian edition. And we might recall in this context Sir Sidney Lee's description that Oxford's, quote, guardian Cecil found Oxford's sense of humor a source of grave embarrassment. In conclusion, some of you may be skeptical that Oxford could possibly have written more than the Shakespeare canon. But don't forget Spain's Lope de Vega. He was 12 years younger than Oxford. Some 3,000 sonnets and 500 plays are attributed to him. 80 of his plays are considered masterpieces. So let's not sell Oxford short. To date, we have failed to give Oxford credit for the full range of his brilliant literary creativity. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Let's not sell Oxford short at all. And I think we can all now read the Decameron with fresh eyes. Thank you very much. Before we hear our third and final formal paper, we thought it would be fun to move for a few moments from the auditory to the visual and share with you 2 delightful videos which finished 3rd and 2nd in this year's 3-minute video contest. So I'm announcing the 3rd place winner, who will receive a check for $412, 412, being April 12th, the birth date of Edward de Vere. The 3rd place winner is Frank Lawler from Seattle. His video is called Schrodinger's Bard in a Box. Now we'll play it for you, Jennifer. Over to you.
My fellow Shakespeare professors, are you irritated by students with questions such as,
Why don't we have any of Shakespeare's manuscripts?
I heard there's no proof that Shakespeare went to school and that he was illiterate. Is this true?
What did Shakespeare do before he came to London? I read somewhere that he worked as a teacher, but then I read somewhere else that he was a law clerk, and then I was told he was traveling abroad as a soldier, and then
blah, blah, blah. Perhaps you, like me, have felt a twinge of concern, a modicum of, dare I say it, wavering over these questions. But fear not, I bring you good news. Help is available, thanks to Schrodinger's Bard in a Box. This synthesis of old world magical thinking and cutting-edge particle physics contains a quantum interpretation of Shakespeare's entire biography. It's light, portable, and comes in 5 fashionable colors. Yes, all of Shakespeare's correspondence, academic records, and manuscripts have been tragically lost. And yes, weak-minded Philistines misguidedly seek mundane evidence. But we are not some sort of CSI Stratford. True Shakespearean researchers firmly stand upon the shoulders of clever scholars, resting upon the shoulders of infallible academics, perched upon even wiser clavicles of knowledge, and so on, creating an unassailable tower of intellect going back 400 years. Thanks to its unique one-way slot, Schrodinger's Bard in a Box can store an infinite number of mutually contradictory theories and speculations, collectively explaining away every single gotcha a misguided freshman or wayward grad student can throw your way.
Did we lose all his manuscripts and correspondence over time due to really bad luck, or did they all like burn up at once in a really bad fire?
Yes.
Did they just not keep records at the Stratford School, or did Shakespeare learn to read and write at home?
Yes.
in the time between leaving Stratford and going to London to write plays, was Shakespeare what? A touring actor, or a teacher, or a law clerk, or a soldier, or a baker, or...
Yes.
Man, what the f***?
Call now for a special offer. Warning, do not open, look into, or closely examine Schrodinger's Bard in a Box. Doing so will void the warranty and may result in ridicule, persecution, academic expulsion, death, and strange rashes. No refunds.
Great fun. And if you weren't sure about that one, I'm absolutely sure you'll love this next video, which came in second in our contest. The second prize in our contest this year is 700, lucky 7, plus Earl 17. So a check for $717 will be going out to Thomas Price. He's from Australia, a newcomer to the authorship question. He told us that his sister was an Oxfordian, and for the longest time he thought she was crazy, but now maybe not so much. Making the video, he said, was an eye-opening experience for him, and he says he's been online a lot over the last few months watching the SOF's YouTube channel and catching up on all the research available, and that's why we do this contest. I think this one is terrific. The second place video contest winner, Thomas Price's The Tale of Wondrous William. Over to you, Jennifer.
The Tale of Wondrous William. A long time ago, in the island kingdom of Britain, there lived an amazing man called Wondrous William. His parents never read him any stories because they couldn't read, but the young William would learn himself how to tell stories to all the children in the world. There was a school in his village, but no one knows if he went there. The best we can say is that he may or may not have gone to this school. But in any case, he would have left school at age 13 to help in his father's business. As a teenager, he helped his father make leather gloves and perhaps farmed and sold grain. But in his spare time, he was secretly preparing himself to write all the great stories he would soon tell the world. There was much to learn and so little time to learn it. He wanted his stories to have hundreds of legal terms, only known to expert lawyers, but alas, they did not teach this kind of law at the school that he may or may not have attended. He needed to read and understand at least 6 languages: Latin, Greek, Italian, French, Spanish, and English. But sadly, not all of these were taught at the school that he may or may not have attended. He planned to tell stories of the far-off kingdom of Italy. But the school that he may or may not have attended had no field trips to Italy and no Italian foreign exchange students. He needed to know as much about medicine as any doctor, as much of the Bible as any priest, 140 different kinds of plants, how kings hunt foxes and train falcons and raise horses, and fight wars, and sail ships, and the art of music, and everything known by the greatest scientists, historians, and philosophers throughout history. He needed to be ready by age 28, when he planned to start writing at least 2 great stories every year for the next 20 years. He needed to do it in complete secrecy, so that no one could ever see him do it, not even his own family. An ordinary man might have failed, but Wondrous William succeeded in inventing 1,223 characters, who delivered 34,000 speeches, with the wisest and cleverest things ever said. He added 1,700 new words to the English language. And he did this with only 4 tools. 1 was genius, 2 was imagination, 3 was his neighbor's library, and 4 was his magic pub. A special tavern frequented by scores of talkative Italians, lawyers, doctors, musicians, soldiers, aristocrats, philosophers, and historians. While many a tale is but make-believe, the legend of Wondrous William is entirely true, which you must believe if you do not want other children to call you a crackpot or mentally deranged.
Quite wondrous, tremendous imagination. We'll now turn to our final formal paper of the day, and it has to do with the authorship question and the ethics of belief. It's a fascinating and heavyweight subject offered up to us by a University of Winnipeg academic librarian who's been writing and speaking extensively in recent years on Shakespeare and epistemology, Shakespeare and knowledge. How do we know what we know about the bard? He's published in the Oxfordian and Brief Chronicles and done a noteworthy TED Talk on the subject. He even supported me in print some years ago when I hosted one of our annual conferences in Toronto and was attacked for my views by a theater critic in a major Canadian newspaper. What else is new? His paper is called Stratfordian Epistemology and the Ethics of Belief. Please give your attention to my friend and colleague, Michael Dudley.
Thank you very much, Don, for that introduction. Thank you very much again to the organizers for inviting me. And I'd also like to acknowledge Gary Goldstein for his assistance in editing the paper that this talk is based on. So I'm going to share my screen and... Okay, Stratfordian Epistemology and the Ethics of Belief. Several years ago, I came across an article online about our post-truth era that encouraged readers to check out the work of the now mostly forgotten English mathematician and philosopher William Kingdon Clifford, who in 1876 wrote a paper and delivered a speech called The Ethics of Belief. And in it, he wrote that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. He was saying that no station of person, no belief seemingly insignificant can be beyond examination. What he was saying is that we all share a duty to inquire. And I was immediately struck by this article, and I wanted to look into Clifford and discovered a whole field of study in epistemology called belief ethics. And I wanted to look at how we could apply belief ethics to the authorship question. After all, as Rick Waugaman mentioned, I think at the spring symposium, that the Folger Shakespeare Library was selling a t-shirt that said, "I believe Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare." Well, I was asking myself, what does it mean to say that belief in Shakespeare as Shakespeare is a belief, and it's not a form of inquiry? What does that belief state look like? And is it an ethical one? But before we can answer that, we need to look at what I'm calling Stratfordian epistemology. Now, I don't think any Shakespeare biographer, any Stratfordian scholar actually even thinks about it this way. But I think the epistemology, the research paradigm, if you will, would look something like this: that a Shakespeare biographer's subject is works that they consider emerging from natural genius and imagination rather than education and lived experience. They are also trying to study an historical person about which little is known. What is the basis of knowledge for the Shakespeare biographer? Well, there are biographical documents, but these are of no literary relevance. And they will also say, as we saw in the videos, that most contemporary evidence is now lost. But then the works themselves, they say, can offer us no knowledge about the author's life, social class, personality, or beliefs. This then necessitates a heavy reliance on traditions found in previous biographies. And again, that video we just saw showing the scholars stacked up one on top of the other. The justification for the Shakespeare biographer is that the author's identity is a sacred certainty beyond questioning, and that Shakespeare must be defended against anti-Shakespearean doubt. Stratfordians are themselves the only reliable experts on Shakespeare, while doubters are anti-Shakespearean, non-scholarly, and unworthy of engagement. The final element would be the methodology, and that is that the biographer must use their imagination owing to a lack of documentary evidence, but then layered with considerable literary criticism. Well, if we step back from this construction, we see that we're dealing with works of imagination that must be written about, or at least the author, the supposed author, must be written about using the biographer's imagination, because the works can give us no knowledge. There's no documentary evidence that definitively links Shakespeare to the works, but at the same time, belief in the authorship of Shakespeare as Shakespeare is a certainty. What we're seeing here is multiple layers of belief. And for those of you who saw my presentation at the spring symposium, what I propose is that Stratfordianism isn't just an authorial proposition or a theory of authorship, it's a belief system. And it looks something like this. There's the propositional belief that Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon was the author William Shakespeare, but there's no direct documentary evidence for this. Instead, it is buttressed by a second-order belief about the belief that it is a certainty beyond doubt and beyond questioning. The third belief are the explanatory beliefs. The lost years, the miracle of genius, the mermaid tavern, that key documentary evidence is now lost. But these are all based on faith. There's no actual evidence for these beliefs. There's also a reflexive belief about the believers themselves, that they are authoritative and they cannot be questioned about the proposition. Fifth is the ethical belief, that questioning the proposition is not just factually incorrect, but actually immoral. And finally, a juridical or justice-based belief that those who do question the proposition may be justifiably marginalized by institutions of scholarship. All of these levels of belief are mutually reinforcing. How ethical is this belief? Why should we consider ethics in belief at all? Well, belief ethicists say that we need to be concerned about ethics because inquiry must always be based on an honest search for truth. We can't cherry pick the evidence that we like and discard that which we disagree with or we find inconvenient. But the other thing is that we can, to some extent, choose to believe things for what's called non-epistemological reasons. Like billions of other people, I choose to believe in life after death. It brings me comfort. I can face life better that way. Do I have evidence for that? Of course not. The only way to get evidence is to die, and as dedicated as I am to research, I'm not willing to do that just yet. So there is this aspect of being able to choose. But if we have beliefs that are blameworthy, that are not based on a truth-conducive process, these can lead to other blameworthy beliefs, which actually turn out to be false. And if we take actions on those false beliefs, that has an impact on the real world. Other people who know us may call upon us to help shape their beliefs. So as belief ethicists stress, these are not just things that are in our head, but they have an effect on others and the world around us. Shakespeare was actually deeply concerned with the ethics of belief and, as Clifford put it, the duty to inquire. Hamlet is confronted by the ghost of his father, who tells him that his uncle Claudius murdered him. Does Hamlet act on this information right away? No, because he's not sure if the apparition is a demon from hell or an honest ghost. So he recognizes his duty to inquire. He has the traveling actors put on the murder of Gonzago to reenact the murder, and he observes how his uncle responds. He basically sets up a social science experiment. And when Claudius responds furiously, Hamlet realizes that the ghost is telling the truth. Othello, on the other hand, does not recognize his duty to inquire. Despite demanding ocular proof from Iago of Desdemona's unfaithfulness, he accepts Iago's evidence. He accepts that Iago is honest, and he sees Desdemona's actions through the lens of the evidence that Iago presented to him. So he doesn't inquire further, with tragic results. Stratfordians also often frame their criticism of post-Stratfordians and Oxfordians in ethical terms. Paul Edmondson and Sir Stanley Wells, for example, in their Shakespeare Bites Back, write that fictions we might choose to tell ourselves about the past become no less valid than interpretations constructed through empirical evidence, such as documents and material remains. Ultimately, they write, this is a deeply moral point. A denial of evidence amounts to a lie about the past. People who are duped by conspiracy theories find in them something they may like to believe. It may be enticing to believe about stolen documents, etc., but the belief itself doesn't make the fantasy true. So I doubt very much that they're familiar with the literature of belief ethics, but they are using that lens. But what if we turn that ethical lens back on Stratfordians and look at their beliefs and their assertions? What will we find? So I decided to give myself a crash course in belief ethics. I did my own research. I went on Facebook and Twitter and found out the things that people believe in. Actually, no, I did a literature review. I read 16 scholarly articles and scholarly chapters about belief ethics, and I pulled out of them a set of conditions, which I'm going to explain in a minute. But first, let's start again with William Kingdon Clifford. He wrote in his essay that if a man, holding a belief which he was taught in childhood or persuaded of afterwards, keeps down and pushes away any doubts which arise about it in his mind, purposely avoids the reading of books and the company of men that call in question or discuss it, and regards as impious those questions which cannot easily be asked without disturbing it, the life of that man is one long sin against mankind. Well, I'm sure this reminds you of certain people. The speech that he gave, this essay, set off a flurry of responses at the time, 1876. People were responding with criticisms like, well, we can't possibly question all of our beliefs. Clifford said that, yes, we can rely on experts for some of our beliefs, but we have to make sure that they themselves have done their duty to inquire. But it took 20 years for there to be a response that still resonates, and that is William James' essay, The Will to Believe, from 1896. William James, by the way, is the brother of Henry James, who did the famous quote saying that he was sort of haunted by the conviction that the divine William was a fraud. What he pointed out was that some beliefs, we may have guesses that turn out to be true. So a guess can be a pathway to real knowledge. But we can believe things for non-epistemological reasons that result in positive outcomes. So a person who's seriously ill can choose to believe that they'll get better, and in fact, it helps them recover. He also wanted to defend the validity of religious faith. We don't go around gathering evidence for the existence of God. It goes against the whole point of faith. But there was one really important thing that he argued in his essay, and that is that a belief based on a supposition is permissible if three conditions are met. One is that the hypothesis must be live rather than dead to the believer. The second is that the choice to believe or not is not trivial, but momentous. And then most importantly, that the decision is a forced one, so that a choice to wait for more evidence, it isn't an option. You have to make a choice now, and it's a momentous matter. So we're going to keep these points in mind. What I did then in reading these articles and chapters is I pulled out these conditions for ethical belief. But the most important thing to remember is that belief ethicists are not really concerned with whether or not a proposition is true or false. Any empirical verification of whatever proposition is the responsibility of the researchers in that field. So accordingly, I'm not even going to talk about whether or not Shakespeare was Shakespeare, whether that's a true or false statement. Instead, belief ethicists are concerned with whether or not a belief has been acquired through what they call a truth-conducive process, and whether it's being asserted ethically. Is it ethical and praiseworthy, or unethical and blameworthy? And is that blame just epistemological in terms of the knowledge base, or is it morally blameworthy? Is it having a negative impact on other people and the world around us? So don't worry, I'm not going to read this slide. I know there's an awful lot of text here, but I wanted you to see at a glance the 12 points, the 12 conditions that I pulled out. Now, I didn't get these from one place. As far as I know, nobody has assembled these 12 in this way. Not all belief ethicists talk about all these conditions. They're not a standard as such, but they do demonstrate the complexity, the multi-layered nature of ethical belief. And I'm going to go through these points one by one. And I also want to stress that I tried to pull out as many possible conditions for ethical belief as possible to give Stratfordians as many chances as possible to demonstrate that they are being ethical and praiseworthy. So here we go. We're going to ask if belief in Shakespeare of Stratford is ethical and praiseworthy. We're going to go back to the Stratfordian belief system. We're going to just take the first belief, the propositional belief that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. We'll come back to the other 5 ancillary beliefs later. Okay. So the first condition is that the doxastic agent, okay, doxa is from the Greek for belief or opinion. So the doxastic agent or believer is intellectually obligated to form and assert the belief. So we're not concerned here that 99% of humanity is simply acculturated into belief of the Stratford Shakespeare. All of us were, right? It's part of our school system, our popular culture. What we're concerned with here are those who are intellectually or professionally obligated to form and assert the belief. So people like Jonathan Bate, James Shapiro, Sir Stanley Wells, etc. Yes, this condition is met. There exists a body of people who are intellectually and professionally obligated to form and assert this belief. The second condition, that the agent recognizes their duty to inquire. Well, in this case, the Stratfordians, for the most part, fail this condition because they reject this duty quite often. We hear, of course, I didn't read that. It's ridiculous, a conspiracy theory. And that they will take the evidence at hand, such as title pages saying William Shakespeare, as prima facie evidence that that refers back to Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon. They don't inquire further into the nature of that evidence. Condition 3, evidence that may support the belief is known by the doxastic agent to exist and is available to them. Well, in this condition, The Stratfordians fail here too as well, because no evidence, no direct evidence linking Shakespeare to the work is known to exist. Even Sir Stanley Wells admits this in his chapter in Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. There is no direct evidence. Condition 4, the agent does not allow their own motivations and biases to unduly influence their use of available evidence. Well, most Stratfordians pretty much make it clear that they are motivated knowers. They consider doubt to be anti-Shakespearean, the result of conspiracy theories. They compare doubters to Holocaust deniers. Paul Edmondson and A.J. Leon in their chapter in Shakespeare in the Digital World compare defending Shakespeare's biography to defending freedom and democracy. So that motivation compels them to view the evidence in a particular way, basically confirmation bias. Condition 5, beliefs are acquired through an honest and open inquiry with all available evidence. Most Stratfordians fail here as well. The book Shakespeare Beyond Doubt just ignored 60 years worth of authorship scholarship. As Catherine Chiljan points out in Shakespeare Suppressed, that there's almost 100 instances of contemporary references and allusions to the works of Shakespeare that are simply too early for them to be referring to anything done by William Shakespeare. And so most Stratfordians simply ignore all of those allusions. So this condition isn't fulfilled. The evidence gathering in support of the proposition is highly selective. Condition 6, where evidence is incomplete, speculation is permissible, but it must be asserted with appropriate cautions. Stephen Greenblatt notoriously begins the book Will in the World with "Let us imagine." And Shakespeare biographies are all consistently filled with conjectural prose, must have been, reasonable to assume, etc. Filled with conjecture, and yet the belief in the subject of the biography is asserted with absolute certainty, out of all proportion with those suppositions. Condition 7, beliefs align as closely as possible to reality, leading to further true beliefs. Well, as post-Stratfordian scholars have been pointing out for nearly 200 years, the traditional biography simply doesn't make sense. It doesn't ring true. As Diana Price and Bonner Miller Cutting have pointed out in their books, that Will Shakespeare as an author is a complete outlier compared to other contemporary writers or the context of the times. So the proposition does not comport with known facts about contemporary authors, society, literature, politics of the time, or what is generally known about the creative process. Condition 8, doxastic agents are open to self-regulation and reassessment. Well, here I'm going to be generous and offer partial points because in recent years, Stratfordians have been promoting co-authorship or collaboration, although this is very controversial. The New Oxford Shakespeare, edited by Gary Taylor and Company, Brian Vickers in his book Shakespeare Co-Author, Vickers being very critical of Taylor and the New Oxford Shakespeare. But this is just an instrumental change. This is not a substantive reassessment about Shakespeare's authorship. So I'm only acknowledging partial points here. Condition 9, assertions conform with the available evidence and are proportionate to it. So here's where we take beliefs out of our own heads and we bring them into the world by asserting them. And assertions have to be proportionate to the evidence. Well, there is no direct evidence. And so to say Shakespeare's authorship is beyond doubt is wildly disproportionate to the available evidence. Condition 10, agents do not dogmatically maintain beliefs in the face of conflicting evidence. And of course, this condition fails as well because Stratfordians rarely, if ever, engage with the evidence that contradicts their proposition and dogmatically insist on the veracity of the proposition. And condition 11, agents are basing their beliefs on the arguments of knowledgeable others who are known to have adhered to these principles. So this again is that stack of people going back to the 17th century. Well, this condition isn't fulfilled either because the practice of Shakespearean biography has never been based on a truth-conducive process. all biographers repeat traditions, such as that Shakespeare was a lawyer's assistant or that he poached a deer. Okay, so that's the first proposition, the first element of the Stratfordian belief system. What about the ancillary beliefs? We need to look at the belief system again. We've got the second order belief about the belief, the explanatory beliefs, the reflexive belief about the believers, the ethical belief, and the juridical belief that doubters should be punished. Well, again, all of these conditions are based on faith. There's no evidence for any of these. The 12th condition that I got from the literature is that beliefs emerging from these conditions, i.e. empirical inquiry, can only be supported by similarly acquired non-fideistic beliefs, okay? And fideism is faith-based. So an example here would be a geology professor who's a devout Christian cannot in a public school tell their students that earthquakes are caused by the movement of tectonic plates as the result of God's will. They may believe that, but they can't ethically assert that because it's combining something that's empirically verifiable with faith. And what we see here in these ancillary beliefs is just that. What should be an empirically based belief based on historical documents is instead buttressed by fideistic beliefs. Okay, so what do we have? We have 12 conditions for ethical and praiseworthy belief. I didn't make these up. I got these from a body of literature that goes back over 140 years. We're talking about the biography of one of the best known individuals in history. And yet, virtually none of these conditions for ethical belief are met. Belief in the Stratford Shakespeare on the part of expert Stratfordians meets virtually none of the conditions necessary for ethical belief. Instead, it is supported primarily by ancillary faith-based beliefs. And it certainly doesn't meet William James' standard for when dealing with insufficient or ambiguous evidence. It's not a forced belief. No one is forcing Stratfordians to back Will Shakespeare as the author. There's time to reevaluate. Many post-Stratfordians are agnostic about who the author was. So clearly, the decision to emphatically insist that Shakespeare was Shakespeare is being maintained for non-epistemological reasons, because of cultural and intellectual inertia, because careers are based on it, because tens of thousands of books and articles have been written based on it. But these are not reasons for belief based on evidence. What are the implications of this? The public is asked to accept on faith that the experts in this field are authoritative and cannot be challenged on their belief, which is not based on evidence, which is actually rather authoritarian. It inappropriately applies fideistic values to empirical inquiry and institutions of higher learning, which is inappropriate. And it leads to a host of other blameworthy beliefs, and which we've already heard several times today, that, as Charles Beauclerk said, if you get Shakespeare wrong, you get the Elizabethan age wrong. As Michael Delahoyde said, you get creativity wrong. So generations of students have been enculturated into this unearned belief. Think about the misallocated intellectual costs, centuries of countless people, of immeasurable hours spent trying to find evidence, trying to tie together Shakespeare with these works, writing these countless books and articles attempting to make this connection. Think of the lost opportunities, the knowledge that could have been gained, but has not been, particularly in the last 100 years since Loney discovered Oxford. So what I would argue here is that we're not just dealing with epistemological blameworthiness in that the knowledge base hasn't been arrived at properly, but because this has had such a profound impact on the world, that there's really serious moral blameworthiness here as well. So, but I want to stress, I'm not saying that, individually, I'm not saying that Sir Stanley Wells and James Shapiro are themselves unethical or that they're knowingly unethical. What I'm saying is that under present conditions, any assertion of certainty on the part of any Shakespeare expert to the effect that Shakespeare was Shakespeare cannot be made in a manner consistent with ethical belief. So according to these external conditions drawn from philosophy, asserted conviction regarding the Stratford Shakespeare on the part of experts is profoundly unethical and blameworthy. What does this mean for the future of the authorship question? Well, because belief ethicists are not concerned with whether something is true or false, the ethical approach avoids entirely debate over competing evidence. Instead, it focuses on processes of inquiry. And we can argue that Stratfordian's process of inquiry has been completely inconsistent with the ethics of belief. Loney's positivist methods, by contrast, are the exemplar of a truth-conducive process. And it begs the question, is an ethical assertion in support of the Stratford Shakespeare possible? What would it look like? It would have to be a lot more conditional, a lot more humble. It would have to say that Shakespeare is only one candidate among many, and that the evidence is uncertain. That would be an ethical assertion. But might not the revelation of the unethical foundation of the Stratford Shakespeare be another means of initiating a tipping point in the debate? If you are curious about learning more about my work here, the paper Stratfordian Epistemology and the Ethics of Belief is forthcoming in next year's Oxfordian in volume 24, so it's still a work in progress. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll look forward to receiving any questions you may have.
Thank you, Michael. Terrific lecture. We've already had one comment from Brian Wildenthal, who said it was devastating and important, and I would certainly agree with you. My own sense is, therefore what? What do we do next? And that's something that I hope you'll pursue in some of your future work. We're just saying shame, shame to them. What do we do next? Anyway, we're now going to move on and change tempo again. In recent years, many of our members have suggested we offer some alternative methods of presentation at our events. How about an occasional debate? How about an occasional panel? In Oakland, those of you who were there, we had a quasi-debate on the identity of the Dark Lady. It was quite exciting. Today, we're going to try out a Zoom panel about the claim made in a volume that appeared earlier this year that Thomas North, long acknowledged as a source for Shakespeare, was actually a playwright himself, and that the Stratford man had access to these totally missing plays. I'm going to say nothing else, however. Instead, I'm going to turn the Zoom mic over to SOF President Bob Meyers, who will host and introduce the panelists. Bob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Don. I look forward to a very interesting discussion. We have the authors of the book you referenced, which is called and is North by Shakespeare. The authors are Dennis McCarthy and Michael Blanding. Actually, I guess Blanding is the author writing about McCarthy's work. Dennis McCarthy is an author, an independent scholar in several fields who in recent years has focused on Sir Thomas North's connections with the works of Shakespeare. Michael Blanding is an investigative journalist and New York Times bestselling author. His book was The Map Thief. His most recent work, North by Shakespeare, explores Dennis's research about Thomas North. And the third person with us is our friend Bryan Wildenthal, a law professor, an Oxfordian, and an independent scholar of the Shakespeare authorship question. He is the author of the book I just showed you, Early Shakespeare Authorship Doubts. Our process here will be that Dennis Michael, and Bryan will give brief opening remarks, and then we'll have a discussion and hopefully questions. So Dennis, let me go to you first, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, I started out so great too. Bryan, I should have your book right here. So I love Oxfordians and I love being here, and I particularly respect Bryan's work. And I should have his book right here when he showed the book, and I'm like, oh, I should have. But my name's Dennis McCarthy. I'll be very quick. Michael Blanding's book, North by Shakespeare, gives the history of Thomas North and the life of Thomas North, and focuses on why I think that he wrote the plays. But if I can just maybe share a screen, we'll see if this is possible. If I can't, you have to go to Sir Thomas North .com, and that's where most of the passages. Well, Michael Blanding focuses on Thomas North's life, and he does discuss the passages. You really don't get a sense of it until you actually look at all of the passages from Sir Thomas North's writings that you then find in the Shakespeare canon. And you can go on its webpage and just keep searching. This just shows you a brief view. This is play after play, and it's every play in the canon. The passages on Thomas North that Thomas North wrote and that are borrowed in the Shakespeare canon represent the single most significant number of borrowings from one author to another in the history of English literature, and it's not even close. If I'm going to see if I can share my screen without doing it again. And I'm still talking, okay. And I showed www.sirthomasnorth.com, in which you can go see these passages. Michael Blanding's work focuses on the biography, and he does discuss some of the passages, but you have to go to www.sirthomasnorth.com to see it all. And this is what is used, identical language that authors repeat again and again and again, is what is used in authorship identification. This is done by the FBI in order to find anonymous authors. This holds up in a court of law. This is successfully, again and again, found anonymous authors. This includes the Unabomber, in which, for example, they found with his manifesto and Ted Kaczynski's lines, and they found the same lines over and over. Well, with Shakespeare North, you've got thousands. And let me just try to, I think I'm sharing the screen again. I'm not sure if you can see this. Yes?
We're not seeing the screen share, Dennis.
Okay. One more time. Here we go. Now?
No.
Maybe I'm pressing share screen. Anything? All right. It's just to make it clear, more passages are borrowed from William Shakespeare. It's not like, well, everyone borrows or everything's derivative. It represents a peculiar kind of obsession by the playwright of Thomas North's works that begins with his first play, in which he must have multiple works of North in front of him, in which he's borrowing multiple different passages. And it continues play after play throughout his entire life. And these are thousands of lines. The next most extraordinary example isn't 1/20th in terms of plagiarism of one author to another, isn't 1/20th of what it is. It's an obsessive plagiarist, and it's an obsession that occurs throughout his life. And if you go to www.thomasnorth.com, and if I could show you the things, you would see them. And I'm going to let Michael Blanding talk because I'm not doing very well right now.
Keep those thoughts. Michael, go ahead.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to this panel and for a chance to talk about my book and also talk about Dennis's research. I'll be really brief in my opening remarks, and because I'm sure we'll get to a lot of these issues during the panel, but I just wanted to introduce myself and sort of where I'm coming from in terms of the authorship debate and in terms of the question of who wrote Shakespeare's plays. And that's as the perspective of a journalist. I've been a journalist for 25 years. I've written articles for the New York Times, Boston Magazine, Wired, Slate, other publications. And I've also written 2 books. The first one was an expose of the Coca-Cola Company. The second one was a true crime story about a thief of rare maps. And to be honest, I hadn't really thought much about the Shakespeare authorship debate before Dennis approached me about 6 years ago. And but I was so intrigued when he started sending me information that I ended up publishing an article on the front page of the New York Times about some of his findings, and then I expanded that story into this book. And if there's one thing that I'm good at, it is really researching a topic and really diving in deep into a topic and really learning something and kind of taking it apart. And I think sometimes there's this perspective as a journalist, being somebody who's sort of supposed to be unbiased and sort of, be a stenographer to different points of view and present them side by side. And there's certainly journalists who do that. I think as an investigative journalist, I see my role as one of taking the information and really, as I say, researching it, analyzing it, and presenting it to my reader in a way that I'm not afraid to express my own opinions and my own conclusions that's sort of, based on that research. So, over the last 6 years, I've read or reread most of the plays. I've read multiple commentaries. I've read multiple books on English history, books about Shakespeare, and also a number of books about the authorship debate and books about Oxford, but also other candidates. And, I've come to the conclusion that Dennis's ideas are just really exciting and really unique. And whether you believe that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare or Oxford wrote Shakespeare, or you're not sure, I think that, the extent of what he's uncovered really needs to be examined and looked into really seriously. And, to the extent that I've seen it, embraced by Oxfordians, it's been really exciting to me to have that conversation and be on the Facebook groups and in forums like this and be able to have that conversation. And I would just urge everyone watching here. I don't think that Dennis and I are going to convince you tonight that North was the Oxford and not Shakespeare, but I think that North was the author and not Oxford, but I think that there's a lot of areas of common ground. There's a lot of areas where by seriously considering the kind of ideas that Dennis has put forward, it really may, move forward the debate in a lot of new ways. So I'm really excited to be here to talk about it.
Thank you for being here. Let me call on Bryan to come in and add something to our introductions.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really honored to be here, and welcome to the conference, Dennis and Michael. And was that a slight Freudian slip? Maybe I heard, Michael, that you said North was the author and not Shakespeare. I'm sure we won't convince you tonight that Oxford is the author, but if we could tilt you more to that Shakespeare definitely wasn't, that would be a little progress. But I want to make 2 key points at the outset. And one, we'll get into obviously questions and some obviously the disagreements between Oxfordians and Northerners, but one is to highlight the common grounds that exist between Oxfordians and those who advocate or write about the Thomas North theory, like our friends Dennis and Michael. And I'll say more about that in just a minute. My other key point is just the duty we all have as scholars or Shakespeare enthusiasts, as I see it, to read each other's work carefully and respectfully and with an open mind. And I myself have enjoyed reading Michael's book. I've also read Dennis's book, and I do have the show and tell. I actually forgot to bring my own, or actually this is Dennis's original book, this one that's no longer available. And I forgot to bring my own book, but I've talked about that before. And then more recently, Dennis's book co-authored with Professor June Schluter about the 1555 travel journal attributed to North, and other writings about the North theory. So I've learned a lot from their work. I'm still trying to absorb it and evaluate it with as open a mind as I can muster. I appreciate the fact that Dennis and Michael have read and cited Oxfordian scholarship. There's always more to explore for all of us. Mainstream Stratfordian scholars have the same duty and responsibility to read other scholars' work respectfully with an open mind, and they have never discharged this duty well. The scholarly work of Oxfordians, published over more than a century now, deserves far more respect and attention. Very briefly, that work has shown remarkable parallels between Shakespearean works and the life of Oxford. Dozens, indeed hundreds, of parallels to Oxford's surviving personal letters and at least 20 early poems. Even Orthodox scholars agree he wrote, parallels to Oxford's own markings in his personal Bible, linking to biblical references throughout the canon. There's also Oxford's public reputation in his own time as a poet and playwright, evidence strikingly scarce in the case of Thomas North. Now, going back to my point about common grounds, Dennis and Michael, and perhaps Professor Schluter too, I'm not sure, but perhaps they can tell us more, share with Oxfordians at least 4 basic insights central to both theories, which all diverge sharply from Stratfordian orthodoxy. Common ground number 1, the original primary author of the Shakespeare canon came from an elite and privileged social background. He was familiar with aristocratic and court traditions and English, French, and Italian nobility. Common ground number 2, this author at a minimum personally traveled to Italy. He had direct and intimate experience with Italian art, culture, and geography. Our friends Dennis and Michael, of course, believe that this elite Italophile was Sir Thomas North. We Oxfordians believe he was Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Common ground number 3, this author's career timeline began long before Shakespeare of Stratford came of age, perhaps even before he was born, far too early for him to have been the original primary author. And relatedly, and contrary to the myth of the so-called 1604 problem, the evidence easily fits and actually supports that the true author died as early as 1604, the very year Oxford died, and also the year North may have died, though I understand there is some uncertainty about exactly when North died. My own book, Early Shakespeare Authorship Doubts, which Bob kindly mentioned, points out 5 publications during Shakespeare's own time, indicating that the true author died years before 1616. And this is obviously an interesting common ground between Oxfordians and Northerners. Common ground number 4, Dennis and Michael agree with Oxfordians that the play All's Well That Ends Well reflects the life of Edward de Vere. Dennis believes Bertram is Oxford, and Paralis is Oxford's servant, the playwright John Lilly. In Hamlet, Dennis agrees Polonius is Lord Burleigh, Oxford's boyhood guardian, father-in-law, and lifelong nemesis, and Queen Elizabeth's most powerful minister, and he thinks Osric is, again, Oxford's servant, Lily. We appreciate these concessions, which I don't think any Orthodox Stratfordian has ever been willing to endorse. We Oxfordians, of course, point to many more Shakespearean plays and poems that bear Oxford's biographical fingerprints. I look forward to further thoughts Dennis and Michael may have about all that. They have written and spoken eloquently about the importance of knowing the true identity of the author and the profound influence of any author's life on their writings. All 4 of these common grounds I mentioned were insights pioneered by J. Thomas Looney and other early Oxfordians a full century ago. So thank you, Dennis and Michael, again for joining this conference and joining Oxfordians in this quest. I'm sure you may want to jump in and start responding to some of the points I made, so I look forward to a lively discussion.
All right, so which of you guys would like to respond first? And then we'll keep your answers short. I suspect there are going to be lots of questions. So Michael, you want to go first, or Dennis?
Dennis can respond. It's
okay.
Well, I don't think there's really anything to disagree with. I thought it was Brian, it was a very powerful opening thing. The difference is, I think maybe, am I sharing my screen now?
Yes.
There you go.
there's James Fitzgerald, Forensic Linguistics, and the Unabomber. And these are the lines, Kaczynski's on top, Unabomber below. And these are the lines that, for example, they found in Kaczynski's writings, articles, letters. And that was in the Unabomber's manifesto sent to Washington Post. And they were able to, out of 300 million people, they're saying only one person actually wrote like this and used these lines to make the same arguments. Everyone has linguistic DNA. This is the subject of forensic linguistics. And if you were to do this with Thomas North and Shakespeare, you just see passage after passage, except it's much more extreme. I have thousands of these examples. This is North's above, Shakespeare's below. And you just see line after line after line. And this is not, there are plagiarized passages from North, many of them, but there's also just clearly lines where the author is just recalling what North wrote earlier or just repeating what he's saying. They both share the same linguistic DNA. Now, Bryan did say that Oxford has hundreds of connections, the letters. There's nothing like this. There isn't a single unique line that Oxford wrote. And I don't mean to be obnoxious on that, but there isn't a single unique line, a single unique word string. For example, that never knew what truth meant right here from the dial, which is in Henry VIII, that never knew what truth meant. That occurs nowhere else. All these lines that are in here occurs nowhere else. If you search on early English books online and you search on Google, you will only find these, many of these examples, or they're extremely rare. All of the lines that you think Oxford and Shakespeare share are quite common and much smaller. They're 3-word strings or 2-word strings, or their images, rose in cheeks, or there's I am that I am, where this is with Oxford and Shakespeare, and that's biblical, and it occurs 500 times on Ebo. The fact of the matter is, in terms of unique and rare lines that the playwright shared, he shared 1,000 with or thousands really with Thomas North, and really you've yet to find one with Oxford and Shakespeare. Well, there's thousands.
So let me ask a question, if I may.
Sure.
How did this happen?
Well, in my view, the author. Let me stop sharing screen. In my view, the author, Thomas North, wrote plays for Leicester's Men. We have evidence for that and receipts for that. Wrote plays for Leicester's Men from the 1550s, 60s, 70s, 80s. He was broke. He was out of Roger North's household. And there's an entire story called Groats with the Witch, which explains exactly what happened. Being broke and a gentleman scholar and having all these plays that he had written, he sells the plays to Shakespeare. In fact, it's well known that Shakespeare used old plays. There's a reference to earlier Romeo and Juliet in 1562, which is before Shakespeare was born. There's a reference to an earlier Merchant of Venice, an early Hamlet, but 1562, and that's when Oxford's 12. So that's where Shakespeare got him. We know Shakespeare is using old plays. The question is just who wrote them. Well, it's the guy whose passages are filled in every single play in the canon and whose life. And I also believe that Thomas North's life, and I can go on this play by play, it's Thomas North's life. We actually have if you look at the end of Michael Blanding's book, we have a chronology in which we know when each play was written, starting in the 1550s with Arden of Feversham is one of the first ones, which is about Thomas North's sister and her family servant and the murder of the century. Thomas North's half-sister committed the murder of the century. That's one of his first plays. We have North's journal, handwritten journal, never written, not published till more than a century later. And that was used for Henry VIII and Winter's Tale. And I believe Bryan even enjoyed the correspondences there. And Edward North's father, and I could keep going on play by play. And then you get into the 1560s, then you get into the 1570s, and we know what play he's writing then and why he's borrowing from the latest work that North translated and following his life. So this is a very this is something that I do urge Oxfordians to look at, because I think it's something that should be incorporated into your theory. And I'll just leave it at that and let Bryan respond and shut up for a while.
I did, yeah. I mean, I credit Dennis with doing some remarkable work and the extent of the parallels. And I suspect that, I mean, for me as a starting point, I think Dennis has shown at a minimum that the various writings and translations of Thomas North, some of which seem to have been previously almost unknown and rarely or never discussed in the critical literature, were a far more important and extensive influence on the works of Shakespeare, whether that was the Stratford guy or Oxford or someone else, than any of us had previously imagined. That alone is huge. That is a huge accomplishment, and I think Dennis deserves great credit for it, and your book, Michael, is a fascinating tour guide. But Dennis, it's actually not accurate to say that we don't have any close parallels of that nature. I think it is fair that Oxfordians are not yet as far along as you in using some of these big data tools and using some of this plagiarism software. But if I may cite just one example, I'll be honest, I didn't even prepare this one ahead of time. When you said that we don't have anything more than 3 words or nothing of that quality, I thought of something and quickly went to our website. And so Oxford wrote an early poem. We call it poem number 9, just in the order that Orthodox scholars say wrote, "The trickling tears that fall along my cheeks." And there is a line in this early poem from Oxford's juvenile period. Orthodox scholars agree this is his poem. And this is not 3 words, but 8 words, 3 words and a comma, and then 5 more words. And yes, the comma is in Shakespeare and the comma is in the original Oxford. And so what Oxford said is, let her moan. Sorry, there's a little bit of audio there. Oxford said, let her moan, comma, and none lament her need. Shakespeare in Lucrece, line 977 says, make him moan, comma, but pity not his moans. Very close verbal parallel, identical meaning. And so this is one of the hundreds of parallels in the early poems. Professor Roger Stritmatter primarily, also some others like Joseph Sobran and Cheryl has studied these poems, quite a few people going back to J. Thomas Looney. Now, I can't speak to whether we have thousands or hundreds, and of course, I think there'll be a very involved debate about a lot of the weeds here. But these parallels in the Oxfordian early poems and the letters cannot be so easily dismissed. They, in some cases, and I can't say offhand now because I have only recently gotten access to EBO, and so I can't say how unique this is. I'm thinking there aren't a lot of 8-word lines in Elizabethan literature along the lines of let her moan, comma, and none lament her need, except in Lucrece and in this obscure early Oxford poem.
Michael, you've been graciously silent for a few moments.
Well, I think what's really, what's interesting to me in analyzing this theory is, people will often come and say, we'll grant Dennis the number of lines that are borrowed from North, but either they'll say, well, we already knew this. We knew that Norse Plutarch's Lives was the source for the Roman plays. So what's the big deal? And Dennis's response to that is that, well, it's not just the Roman plays, and it's not just Plutarch's Lives. It's every play in the canon almost, except for The Merry Wives of Windsor and Two Noble Kinsmen, and everything that Thomas North ever wrote, his 3 published translations, his unpublished journal, and his other publications that were quoted before they were even published. So at least the author would have had to have access to all of North's published and unpublished writings and been really obsessed with them and really had them open in front of him, for every play. But I think what's harder to sort of grasp about Dennis's theory immediately, and took me a while as well, is why he has to go the extra step and say that Thomas North wrote these earlier source plays that were being adapted by the playwright. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, by Shakespeare or by Oxford. And, it has to do with the different lines of evidence that Dennis has been able to amass. And for for every one of the plays, he's able to show these verbal parallels that all seem to group around, particular translations that North was writing at that particular time. So there's plays that gather around Plutarch's Lives. There's plays that gather around North's first publication, The Dial of Princes. And then around that same time, Dennis is able to tease out these biographical parallels and these political parallels that would have been uniquely sort of from the lens of North and the other people in his faction. For example, the Earl of Leicester, his patron, and his brother, and other people around him at court. And then he's able to find references to source plays written around that same time. So, plays that have been previously identified as being sources for Shakespeare that we don't have today, lost plays like, 1574 Phoenicia or 1572 Philemon and Philistia, these plays that are listed in the records and have been referenced as sources for Much Ado About Nothing and Two Gentlemen of Verona. And then he's also able to find these references from other writers at the time that seem to be satirically, at least, referencing Thomas North and making puns on Thomas North's name or quoting snippets of Thomas North in reference to plays that sound like Shakespeare. So there's sort of all these converging lines of evidence. And what's really been fascinating, and I think, really you have to, take your hat off to Dennis for being able to do this. For every one of these plays, he's able to use, 3 or 4 or 5 lines of evidence that all sort of point to a particular year and a particular reason why Thomas North would have wanted to write that play in that year. And so, when you look at it in the totality like that, it becomes very hard just to see this as a case of, a later playwright just sort of taking snippets of North's text and sort of reworking them. It's really sort of this whole package that relates to the text, relates to the life, relates to the particular, political and personal motivations of the playwright. And that's what I think really hasn't quite broken through in Dennis's theory, and I really urge people to take a closer look at.
Although Dennis does claim that there was a later playwright who did put this together. Dennis thinks that was Shakespeare of Stratford, correct? If I understand right?
Yes.
Right. Well, that's the part I put aside for a second, but that's and that's the other part that
I guess so. Many Oxfordians would say if Shakespeare of Stratford could do that, Oxford could do it backwards in high heels. But I don't. That I'm not sure.
Okay.
And I'll just say before I turn this over to Dennis, I'll just say that from my point of view, it would be to Dennis's great benefit if he were able to say that and to, and believe that and say Oxford wrote the plays, because then we would have all of you on our side, and we would have this army of Oxfordians behind us, supporting the Northern theory. But Dennis can say why he thinks it was Shakespeare and not Oxford, because
I don't want to go into I don't want to support Shakespeare.
Okay.
But Brian, so that line you gave from Rape of Lucretia and the line from what do you call it? That's, while it's a parallel, kind of, it only is one word in common, moan. It's really just one word and 7 different words. It's not a linguistic fingerprint. I'm literally talking about lines that are identical. There isn't a word different, or it's 7 of 8 words or 8 of 9 words. So for example, if I can share again, I don't know if I'm sharing right now.
Mm-hmm.
My screen. Yeah.
Yes.
So for example, you see, for example, here lie I Timon who lied. That's just a straight borrowing. But last the day that ever I was born. That's last the day that ever I was born. Nowadays, the more is the pity. Nowadays, the more the pity. And these are identical lines that dissolve the bands of this life. And what a woeful case I am in that am. This is literally the words, the identical lines that come up again and again. And that's what they're looking for in the FBI, because you will say the same lines again. There isn't really a Shakespearean quote like that in which you actually type in quotes in Google, word that might be to the prejudice of. If you go right now, put it in quotes, word that might be to the prejudice of. The only thing that comes up is Shakespeare or Thomas North. You can do it again and again and again. I will none of them. They are, and these are, and also even some of the more famous lines, all's well that endeth well. Remember the Ides of March. These are also lines that are in What's Done Cannot Be Undone. These are lines that are in North's work and that are repeated in the thing. So it's not just an echo or a parallel, or it's a vague connection with just 2 or 3 similar words. It's identical lines from all of North's writings, including his unpublished writings, his journal, and it's the most extensive example of verbal fingerprints, which is what is important, ever found.
Yeah, so we do have a lot of verbal fingerprints with identical words. I mean, we may not have collected as many as you have, and I don't in any want to minimize that. Well, so here's another question I have, just kind of looking at it from a different angle. I think for a lot of people sort of looking at the debate from a 30,000-foot perspective, they definitely get the sense that there's this huge amount of textual parallels with Thomas North and the works of Shakespeare. They clearly have heard the Oxfordian arguments if they've read our work, which I guess many people haven't read it, but that there are these parallels with the poems, the letters, and all that. So that's all very interesting. Another interesting angle, and this kind of goes back, Bob had mentioned, or I think actually it was Professor Rubin had mentioned that we previously did a debate about the Dark Lady. What I find fascinating, really, I mean, quite honestly, I find Sir Thomas North a fascinating authorship candidate because he truly is an unusual dark horse in this sense, in that over 450 years, no one has ever seemed to think of him as a playwright or poet, whereas with Oxford, we have an elaborate record of published statements and recognitions during his own time that he was a fine playwright and poet, and there were hints and things in the 17th century, and then of course the Oxfordian movement. A lot of people over more than 100 years now have thought he was a playwright and poet. It's fascinating, Dennis, that until your book was published in 2011, Thomas North really was a dark horse. He really was flying under the radar, and so your argument is that big data has kind of revealed this dark horse. Is there any evidence, what evidence is there that anyone before you ever thought of Thomas North as a poet or a playwright?
Oh, well, I've got an entire page on my sirthomasnorth.com in which, if you go to it, you'll see all sorts of praise for him contemporary. First of all, the only reason I discovered this is because of the satires in which they were clearly outing Ben Jonson. Was the very first thing I published was Sir Thomas North as Sir John Daw, which is in Oxford's Notes and Queries, contemporary conventional journal that identifies Thomas North with the character Sir John Daw in Ben Jonson's Epicene, and ever since the 19th century, scholars have been saying that this guy seems like the Shakespeare author. But there's not just that. There's Haywood puts Thomas North at the top of a list of tragedians.
So Dennis, I have to challenge you on this point. So you have this. Let's leave the screen share on. It's fine with me if you want to leave this screen share, because actually it illustrates my point. I think I can disprove what you're saying with exactly what you've shared here on the screen.
All right, we can discuss this. I can see where you're going to say. I see where you're going to go with this, but
our audience doesn't know where I want to go with this.
Go
so
ahead.
Let me make the point. Because we've obviously, Dennis and I, as you can tell, Dennis and Michael and I for many months have carried on an interesting side conversation. So this is a fascinating piece of evidence. In 1560, as Dennis has shown here, Jasper Haywood did discuss North along with, I believe, 3 other law students at the Inns of Court. I think the other 3, including Sackville, Thomas Sackville, who's another authorship candidate that Dr. Sabrina Feldman has advocated. 3 of them, I believe, later did publish plays. But I think it's a little bit pushing it, Dennis, to say that Jasper Haywood placed North at the top of a list of best tragedians. What Haywood actually said was he was speaking figuratively to Seneca, the ancient Roman tragedian, and he was saying that he was calling upon these law students to pay homage to Seneca, and he specifically said, there you see the self-same North, whose work his wit displays, and dial doth of princes paint. So it seems to simply be referring to the fact that Thomas North, a couple years previously, translated the Dial of Princes, which discusses Seneca extensively, and he's recognizing that. And then he's going on to say that there's some other folks who do this too. So it certainly does not say that North is a tragedian. It doesn't even clearly say he expects North. Maybe he wants North to become a tragedian, but it's very anticipatory. It seems to simply be talking about North's first published translation, Dial of Princes, which you deserve great credit for bringing to light more as a source for Shakespeare. But I really have to question whether this indicates any reputation as a playwright.
Well, I will go against that. He has a painful pen. Melpomene, Woodswell-Ween had taught them for to write. These are the group of Inns of Court students. First of all, there's thousands of lost plays from the era, and therefore there's hundreds of lost playwrights. And especially from this era in 1550s, 1560s, 1570s. Do you know of any work, Bryan, in which someone is praising a playwright from that era, 1550s, 60s, 70s, published at that time, that is complimenting a playwright? And that's why we've lost all the playwrights. I don't think you do, but if you do, please say it.
Yeah, maybe we can close that screen. I think are we done with that page of the...
Okay, well, wait, I just want to say, it's whose work, okay, use of tragedy, taught them how to write. And then it says North, whose work his wit displays, and dial doth of princes paint. Heywood uses work 4 times in this poem to refer to bodies of work. And just to show more evidence that North was a playwright, I have other things in here, for example.
But why couldn't the work be the translation? I mean, the work, North is clearly a great translator.
He's referring to it twice. So work, there are 4 times he refers to work in the poem, in which he's referring to a body of work, writings. He's referring to writings. So whose writings his wit displays, and dial doth of princes paint. Either that, or you would have to say whose work his wit displays, whose dial of princes his wit displays, and dial doth of princes. He's referring to it twice.
Well, wit just means intelligence.
And the muse of tragedy taught them how to write. This is where Inns of Court is where tragedies were being written. Now we've lost a lot of them, and it's believed that the first one wasn't written until about 1560, 1561 with Gorboduc, which is when this is written. But of course, all the other ones that at the Inns of Court are missing. We just don't have all the plays. We're missing thousands of plays from the era. And there is no other playwright really from that era ever being complimented. Sackville gets a compliment way later. But other than that, all of the playwrights from that era have no record. And in fact, except for things like this, there's another one with the George North manuscript in which George North compliments him for both invention and translation. And there's no way to escape that one. He's necessarily distinguishing invention from translation.
Well, Michael, Michael or Dennis, let me jump in with a question. I think especially Dennis. Sure. You said at the beginning, when I said, how did this happen? You said, among other reasons, North was broke. He needed a lot of money. He found a way to make money. So how come his either desire for money or a quote unquote fame associated with the work he got money for kind of disappeared, and we end up with Ted Kaczynski as standing in for Lord North? I mean, give me a sense of what happened in the history as you see it.
I mean, the best way that I can understand it, and this is, reading a lot of books about, playwriting of the time, I really took a deep dive into it. And, North was writing, not only did he start writing 40 years before Shakespeare, but he started writing, he was 20 years older than Oxford, I believe, or 15 years older than Oxford. And let's see, let me do the math. So 30 years older than Shakespeare, 15 years older than Oxford. And, you know, it was at a time when English drama was really getting started, and it wasn't really recognized as the art form, certainly that we recognize it today, but even as the art form that it was recognized later in the Elizabethan period. And during this time, you know, the vast majority of plays were published anonymously, if they were published at all. And so, you know, North would have sort of grown up in this earlier generation where playwriting really wasn't looked at as something that you know, hung your hat on and your fame on. It was only later with, you know, Ben Jonson and Robert Greene and Shakespeare himself that people started really putting their name on it and really, you know, touting themselves as playwrights. And so that's number one. And number two is just, you know, as I think even Stratfordians are starting to appreciate now, the way that plays were written was a much more sort of organic process than we think about it, than we've thought about it in the past. That it was, you know, plays were being taken, they were being, you know, taken from other writers, reworked. You know, even the same writer would rewrite them under different circumstances. If you presented it at court, if you presented at the public theater, if you took it on the road, you know, these works were not fixed in the way that we think they are today. And they were constantly being borrowed from, and other writers were taking works of other writers and reworking them and putting their name on it. And, you know, whether you think Shakespeare was Oxford or Shakespeare, you know, the first published plays by Shakespeare had words like, you know, Dennis can quote this line in verse, but, you know, newly expanded and revised or something. Right. And it was only later, as Shakespeare's fame grew, that we started seeing works that were by William Shakespeare. And so, you know, under the way that intellectual authorship and plagiarism was thought of at the time, there was really no kind of problem with Shakespeare putting his name on these adapted plays from Thomas North and calling them his own. It was only later that started really becoming a problem.
Bryan, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's some good points, Michael. There was one thing a little bit missing in your chronology is the very first thing published under Shakespeare's name didn't say adapted by Shakespeare, didn't say augmented, it said by, it was, the dedication was assigned William Shakespeare, and that's the poems, Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece. So what about the poetry? That was 5 years before any play was published under the name Shakespeare, and it's by William Shakespeare. What's that happening there?
Does it say by William Shakespeare, or does it say Shakespeare's?
It says it's printed William Shakespeare, and so
I don't think it says by William Shakespeare. But anyway, I'll defer to Dennis on this one because this is really
well. The dedication is signed simply William Shakespeare, so it's
the dedication
clearly indicating the author.
W.S.
Yeah.
William Shakespeare. True, but I don't think the play is published as. I don't think the title page says by William Shakespeare.
True. Yeah, and Oxfordians themselves emphasize that same point. That's a curious feature, that it's under the dedication, not on the title page. But my point is there's none of this augmented or, you know, newly adapted, whatever. And so that works for the plays. I see that argument for the plays, but there's a big missing link. And I know Dennis is aware of this, and I believe Dennis may be at some point rolling out some evidence about the poetry. We can't wait to hear it.
Me neither.
There is, just as there is a work describing the life of Thomas North and then his involvement with Shake Scene, this conceited actor in which he's broke, the gentleman scholar is in Groat's Earth of Wit. There's a work that describes how Thomas North wrote the plays. There's an entire work on the origin of Venus and Adonis and why Shakespeare published it and who he paid to do it. And it wasn't just, in my view, it wasn't just Thomas North for Venus and Adonis that was based on an original poem. It was Thomas Nash. And Shakespeare bought it, worked on it, and wanted specifically to get a reputation. At the time, I believe plays were closed because of the plague and needed money. And they just and Thomas Nash even admits to have worked prostituting his pen in this fashion. And he was helping adapt an original poem by Thomas North. I don't expect you to believe that right now, because I haven't really come forward and shown all the arguments and all the evidence, and I haven't really published on it. But I do think the case for the plays, and particularly plays like Arden of Faversham and Henry VIII and Winter's Tale, have now really been proved beyond all reasonable doubt.
Are you doing a book on? Are you doing a book on the sonnets and poems? You are.
I am.
That's
And
great.
it's
Well,
not
I
in
look forward.
It's not in my book for those who haven't been following this. The one thing that Dennis said when I started writing this book, he was very generous to share all of his research with me and let me publish his research before him in many cases. And the one thing Dennis said was, I want to reserve the sonnets for myself. I want to publish about that later. And I respected that as a journalist. So I am just as eager as Bryan and everyone else to see what Dennis has to say about that. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I sincerely really look forward to that. It does sound interesting, Dennis. So I look forward to seeing the evidence you roll out. I'll shift out of attack dog mode a little bit because I wanted to focus on another aspect. And one reason, again, why I sincerely think Dennis's work is really valuable, and why I sincerely urge all of my Oxfordian friends and colleagues to read it carefully, is one thing I would single out in particular, Dennis's work on North's translation of the so-called moral philosophy of Donne. Now that title may confuse many people, many of our viewers. This is a lot of stuff to process. The title refers to an Italian writer named Donne, who was himself merely translating still earlier translations of an ancient Sanskrit text from India, a set of animal fables, different from but somewhat comparable to Aesop's fables, which are better known today in the Western world. And Sir Thomas North then translated this from Italian into English. Now, these Sanskrit fables are very well known in India. My own mother-in-law, and I told her this, she says, oh yeah, we all know about this in India. It's called the Panchatantra in India, which simply means 5 books. And they're also known via Persian and Arabic translations as the Tales of Kalila and Dimna. They've been translated over centuries, indeed millennia, into many languages, all those I mentioned, plus Latin, Greek, Spanish, German, and others. So regardless of all these arguments that Dennis makes about North as the original author and our counter-arguments and all that, North's English translations of these fables were an important source and influence on some memorable Shakespearean works. And Dennis deserves huge credit for unearthing this. That alone, I think, should get a lot more attention from scholars and the popular press. For one thing, it goes a long way to exonerate Shakespeare from this cheap shot criticism that all of us, everyone on this call is a Shakespeare lover. We all love Shakespeare, and we're all annoyed when people dismiss him as just a dead English white guy with a limited cultural outlook tied to one particular era in the history of an island off the coast of Northern Europe. Au contraire, the influence of this Sanskrit Indian source on Shakespeare, which may have undergone cultural transmission through Persia, Arabia, and Africa before reaching Europe, goes far to prove that Shakespeare is a truly universal author. And since many of my family members are from India, I just think it's great that when the British imported Shakespeare to India, along with the colonial Raj, they actually, in some sense, were bringing Shakespeare back home to where some of it originated in one of the key sources. So I just would love to have more attention paid to that. You got to market this one better, Dennis. This is a fascinating part of your work.
I got to market everything better. Yeah, thank you. I agree with you 1,000%, Bryan. That's exactly right. It is more cosmopolitan, and it's really based on Indian Sanskrit. Folktales, this is true of Othello. Really, you can say the origin is from that old Indian fable. And in Cymbeline, the fable of the eagle and the beetle. And there's also other stories. King Lear and the which I really haven't come out with as much, but King Lear and the storm, the entire storm and the entire flood is from a flood story in Moral Philosophy of Donne, and all these things, which is why even King Lear looks like a fable, and there's almost no place names, and it's just darkness and storm and flood, and all of the ideas from it do come from that particular story.
So shifting back to attack. Oh, sorry,
Bryan. Just to add a postscript to that. I think particularly in the play Othello and its debt to Donny, this was one of the things that I just found really delightful about Dennis's research, is sort of finding areas in which the story of Othello departs from Cinthio's original version, and that it really tracks very well in terms of the language, the plot, the characters on this animal fable in the moral philosophy of Donny. And you've got to check this out yourself. But it's about this sort of this mule who is sort of bitter about not having advancement in court and turns this bull against a lion, much as Iago turns Cassio against Othello. And this is something I know, obviously, Oxfordians have their own origin story for Othello, and placing it in the context of Edward de Vere's relationship with Anne Cecil. But I don't think that these two stories are mutually exclusive. And I think it can help explain, why someone like Oxford may have sort of gone to a source like Donny that has these rich stories and adapted some of that for his writing of Othello in the Oxfordian frame of mind. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. One thing, going back to the reputation issue, and that's a fair point that Dennis made, that when you think of the 1560s, 70s, that was kind of a lost era, whereas Dennis noted, we don't really have much of anything from that era about drama. But starting in the 1580s, I just want to kind of lay on the table, from the 1580s with William Webb, Angel Day, George Puttenham, or whoever wrote the anonymous Art of English Poesy, they're praising Oxford as a poet and playwright. In the 1590s, Francis Mears and Edmund Spenser, by the way, who is praising Oxford as beloved by the Muses, and refers to Aetion, who seems clearly to be Shakespeare, says, like his name heroically sounds, and says, a nobler shepherd may nowhere be found. Spenser is basically telling us there is no more aristocratic or socially elite poet than Shakespeare. And while there is this common ground, I mentioned that the North theory, Sir Thomas North was the second son of a baron, it wouldn't quite fit to say there is no nobler shepherd. This sounds like a high-ranking aristocrat. And then up to the 1620s, you have Henry Peacham praising Oxford and not even bothering to list any person named Shakespeare in his list of Elizabethan poets. So from the 1580s to the 1620s, and Thomas North, according to Dennis's theory, wasn't just writing plays back in the 1560s and 70s, but he's living and presumably writing, and we know he's translating, in the 1580s, the 1590s. North did not die until 1604 at the earliest. So I'm just curious that where's the hints? Where's the commentary or the praise that North is a poet or a playwright?
Well, again, you're using Spenser and Aetion. I've got English Seneca, who can pen who yields many good sentences, for example. That's Thomas North, as I believe I show. And there's all sorts of compliments in all of those things about Puntarvalo and Johnson's Puntarvalo, et cetera. And
but why not explicit? Because Oxford's explicitly praised under his own name as a great poet and playwright.
Webb is, well, to be fair, Webb is talking about the poems that Oxford published, which he published in Dainty Devices, Paradise of Dainty Devices. So Webb is talking about that. Puttenham says Oxford is best for comedy, and Mears quotes Puttenham, and then in 1620, Peacham quotes Puttenham. So there's really only one.
And nobody's talking about North as a poet or playwright.
Well, there's only
openly.
No one knows it. Puttenham doesn't know it. There's no reason to believe he knows it. There's only a few people that know it. Johnson knows it. Harvey knows it. Those that do it write about it and quote him and are referring to him as a knight. For example, Puntarvalo is clearly a knight Englishing his travels, or Prospero is also a knight, and Amorphous is also a knight. Sir John Daw is also a knight. They all have the same experiences. It's North's experiences. Groatsworth of Wit, which goes on and connects him to the plays and says he's writing for Shakespeare, goes on about his life. So there's numerous things. There's numerous passages in, and I published on this, Sir John Daw as Sir Thomas North. There's numerous passages in the satires in which are complimenting his writing, saying that he predates Shakespeare and that Shakespeare's following him. And before that, they were saying that Lyly was following him.
Sorry for interrupting. Oh, sorry, Michael, go ahead.
Just to answer your question more directly, Brian, I think, again, sort of putting on my hat as a journalist, I think that I would concede, and maybe even Dennis would concede that, the lack of explicit reference to North as a playwright is probably the weakest part of Dennis's argument. It would be great to have something like Meyers or one of these other writers of the time or later, actually saying that North was a playwright. I would argue that if we had that probably North would have been considered much earlier, and we wouldn't need Dennis here in 2011. Finding this out. And I think, that's countered to some extent by, just the wealth of allusions that Dennis has found contemporary to North, of people writing about North in reference to the plays, quoting North, making puns on the name North, referring to this Italianate night,
Quoting, they quote North.
Right. And so there's that. And then I think, to the same extent that maybe one of the weaker aspects of the Oxfordian theory is the lack of, these direct quotes that Dennis was talking about. And, you could say, well, it was Oxford Juvenilia, it's much, we're versus North's mature writing. So, you could weigh that against each other. But I still think that, it's a strength of the Northern argument to say that, you have these thousands and thousands of shared phrases and hundreds of passages that are reflected in the work. So I think
definitely a fair point about the.
Just to finish my thought, when I weigh the totality of the evidence, I say that definitely on that column, I think North has a weaker check, but on some other areas, I think he has a stronger case. And when I look at the totality, I think it can overcome.
Dennis, you wanted to respond.
Also, there is a much bigger absence of where you would expect something where Oxfordians have a difficult time, and that's it. If you believe that in 1623 that the Herberts, et cetera, are publishing and know that Oxford did it, and that's a big moment in their lives. No one's mentioning it in the Montgomerys or there's a cone of silence, as they say, or whatever. In Oxford's got relatives that go down and they have libraries, they have books. None of the children are mentioning that he wrote Oxford. None of the descendants, the Earls of Oxford that follow, mention it. You've got
in fairness, but in fairness, Dennis, there were very strong social reasons why a noble aristocratic family at Oxford's rank would not want to discuss that.
But not even in personal letters. Not even in personal letters or any writings anywhere or marginalia or never mentioned anywhere. And you've got three families. You got the Montgomerys that go down all the way to today, in which there's no one mentioning it, saying, and who know it, and supposedly in 1623 they know it, and they never once write it down. I think that's more of a bigger mystery than playwrights there are thousands of missing playwrights. We don't know the playwright of Musidorus. No one wrote it down. No one said explicitly someone wrote it. We don't know who the author of King Lear, the other King Lear, and Yorkshire Tragedy, if you don't believe Shakespeare wrote it, or London Prodigal. No one wrote these things down. No one said this is the author. There's thousands of plays that are missing. There's all sorts of absence. We have this is just a standard thing that occurs where you just don't find out. There's anonymous plays are the majority of plays right now in Elizabethan England. Why? Because no one's mentioning the author, no one's mentioning the playwright. Leicester's Men worked from 1559 to 1588. Can you name the playwright? So they had to have the playwrights all the time. Can you name a single playwright for Leicester's Men? Why doesn't anyone just say so-and-so wrote a play for that?
Yeah,
this
I think we
understandable for Thomas North. There's someone had to write them, and whoever wrote for Leicester's Men, you don't have an explicit statement, but you do have satirical comments.
Yeah,
the satirists were writing, and they weren't writing newspapers, so they didn't say Thomas North wrote it. They said English Seneca, the guy who wears Plutarch's plumes, the eloquent apprentice of Plutarch. I mean, it's that obvious. Boreas, who's North. So they
agree. There's a lot of
Thomas North wrote, but they say Boreas did, and he's North.
I agree. There's a lot of
North
gaps
Wind.
and a lot of mysteries, and there are areas where you do have to wonder, like, why isn't Oxford mentioned? I would say again, in terms of who was writing some of those plays in the 1570s and 1580s, we think Oxford himself may have been writing some, and that could account for why years and years before anything is published or known, why Oxford's being praised as among the best for comedy. So those are all fair points. I was attempting, and I apologize, sorry I was interrupting earlier. I do apologize for jumping in earlier because you guys are making some good points. But I wanted to actually go back, Dennis. I was tempted to interrupt when you were talking about Sir Puntar Volo, because I think that's a fascinating point. So just so everyone's on the same page, for those who don't know their Ben Jonson, Sir Puntar Volo is a character in Ben Jonson's play Every Man Out of His Humor. Dennis has some fascinating arguments about him. And in my book, I started diving in a little bit. So Sir Puntar Volo is presented as a knight in the play. It's true. He's not officially presented as a high-ranking aristocrat. However, Sir Puntar Volo is a character who has a grand house, who goes hunting with dogs, and has a number of other indicia that don't really fit with the impoverished, neglected second son of a baron like Thomas North. I would say Sir Puntar Volo sounds an awful lot like an aristocrat and leading that type of lifestyle. And in any event, so there's some interesting material there. I think I would love to dig deeper and find out more about whether Sir Puntar Volo at least is representing the author Shakespeare, whoever that is. If you flip around Puntar Volo's name and translate from the Italian, it basically says will spear. Volo means will, and puntar is a pointed weapon, or could be a spear. So, we're definitely, that's another common ground, at least, that Sir Puntar Volo is some kind of representative figure there. But I'm not totally convinced he's, I'm not sure I quite see the Sir Thomas North. I think he could be Edward de Vere, actually.
Well, yeah, he's a knight. And they introduce him when they describe him, who is over-Englishing his travels. He's a translating knight, and he travels and he goes, and they talk and they say Dial of Princes, which is an important book, but the dial, which is a measuring instrument, and of princes, they do it's like Mirror of Magistrates. It's counselor literature, and he describes table manners, etc., and how to talk and compliment. And they call Puntar Volo the Jacob staff of compliment, which is Jacob staff is a measuring device of compliment, which is kind of, and in case you missed it, they then add, they describe it as later they call it the dial of, to the perfection of compliment, Puntar Volo says, which is the dial of the thought and guided by the sun of your beauties. And he keeps going as he's talking to her, and you get punctilio, and talks about the entire dial face. And
there's a lot of great material there. I would just know, again, Dennis, and who knows, let the chips fall where they may, but just be aware there's a century of Oxfordian scholarship about Puntar Volo that would be worth reading. I strongly urge you to read it and look at it carefully, just as we've been reading your work. And there's some interesting stuff that I was completely unaware of myself as an Oxfordian until literally shortly before I finished my book. I only scratched the surface in my book, and it was just, I think we all agree that Ben Jonson knew where the literary bodies were buried. And so when we can sort out what Ben Jonson knew, I think we will all have a better sense. And I would love to see more written by Oxfordians as well as from Dennis about the Ben Jonson plays and what they mean. But Oxfordians have already written and published a lot of stuff going back literally 80 or 90 years. But the problem is the Orthodox establishment has never read it and doesn't know about it.
Let me ask Dennis and Michael to give us brief summary statements, and then I'll turn it back to Don. I may even ask a question myself. Thank you, Brian. Dennis, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Brian earlier apologized for interrupting me. He had no reason to apologize. He's been extraordinarily polite, and I was interrupting him. I apologize. Brian, you're wonderful. Yeah, we didn't get it solved today. You really pressed me on good points. Yeah, I look forward to continuing these conversations in the future. Let's even, you and I will go off, we'll email. You're so careful and clear thinking will email just about Puntarvalo, Prospero, who also is really obviously the author of the canon, and the name Prospero and the Tempest comes for it. And the Tempest is an autobiography, I believe, of North, but you'll believe of Oxford. And but thank you very much, and I thank you kindly, everyone who patiently listened, as I couldn't figure out how to share my story. Okay, Michael, please.
Michael.
Well, I don't have much to add, except that I think that this is a really good example of the kind of conversations that could be had around this subject. And you know, when you were talking about sort of the Oxfordian dating of some of the plays being earlier, or maybe even Oxford writing early versions of plays, and there's many areas in which the Oxfordian and Northern chronologies really match up and are sort of, you know, looking at sort of different parts of the elephant. You know, for example, in The Merchant of Venice, sort of both tying it to the Queen's Progress of 1578, and a lot of the characters in The Merchant of Venice, the suitors of Portia, being stand-ins for various actors in the conflicts and wars of the time. I think, you know, I drew from Michael Delahoyde's work on that in writing my book. I know Dennis has used that and used other strains of Oxfordian research around the dating, around different you know,
Ramon Jimenez.
Illusions.
Yeah, Dennis has very generously cited Ramon Jimenez, and I was very
brilliant. He's brilliant. He's done great work.
So Ramon's work deserves a lot of recognition. Thank you, Dennis, for citing that.
So let me pose a question. I saw in Michael's book that there seems to be a documentary film being made on Dennis's reporting. Is my memory accurate on that?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take the next step. When will the film come out?
I'm sorry. My daughter, my daughter, Nicole Golovsky, is a film producer, and she's been following me with the camera for a while, thinking I've been onto something, but I hear she's biased. But she followed Michael and I in Italy, and we're talking to Netflix right now.
Excellent.
Wow.
Excellent.
Yeah, this is one of the ways I tell the story in my book is I'm sort of writing about Nicole making this documentary. She's making a documentary about rewriting this book, and we basically just got to go to Italy together and eat a lot of great food. So,
all right. Well, this has been an excellent discussion. I appreciate both of you being here. Bryan, thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and I hope we can do this again. I'm going to turn this back to Don Rubin with my thanks, and I will go off mic or whatever you go off here. So Don, this is back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks again for the opportunity.
Yeah.
And thanks to the whole panel, most fascinating discussion. At this point, we're going to go back to the video contest. Earlier today, we saw the second and third prize winning entries in this year's video contest. To introduce and to announce the winner of this year's video contest, I'm turning the floor over to the chair of the video contest committee from Memphis, Julie Bianchi.
Hey, Julie, they're calling you about the video contest winners.
The line in the Piggly Wiggly was just so wrong. Anyway, but I planned ahead because I put the name of the winner inside my purse, and I really, yeah, Goo Clusters on sale. That was the problem with Black. Sorry. Anyway, this is it. I put it here. Do you like this shirt? A Piggly Wiggly, and it's for Jonathan Dixon, who's the winner of the first prize for his video, What Does It Matter Who Wrote the Works of Shakespeare?
Oh, that's great.
So let's take a look at a bizarre question that invariably comes up during any discussion of the Shakespeare authorship issue, made even more bizarre by the fact that it's often even heard from Stratfordians.
Well, what does it matter who wrote the works of Shakespeare, so long as we have those glorious works themselves?
So what other creative artists do you say that about?
Doubting Shakespeare's authorship is a form of mental illness.
For me, that question, what does it matter who wrote them as long as we have them, in itself proves the validity of the Shakespeare authorship question, because yes, who else does anyone say that about? No one, and especially not when on the other hand they claim there's no doubt about the artist's identity. Here are things you never hear.
Maestro, what is your favorite piece of music to conduct?
No question. The Ninth Symphony, Ode to Joy, gives me goosebumps.
Who composed that one again?
I don't know. Some guy, I guess. What does it matter?
What's your favorite painting?
Starry Night. It's so full of passion and it's so powerful.
Well, who painted that one?
Who cares?
So yet again, among all creative artists in history, an exception has to be made for Shakespeare and Shakespeare alone. To the rules we normally apply to any other human being.
You're the director of this art museum. Mm-hmm. Why don't you take all the names off all of the artworks? Because what does it matter who did them as long as we have the works themselves?
That's stupid.
Okay, well, how about this? How about you take all the information about the artists off, because how can that possibly add to our enjoyment or understanding of the art?
Is this for real?
Always an exception for Shakespeare, and yet we're not allowed to ask why that is. Well, let's take that position to its logical conclusion. Let's stop writing biographies. Let's take all the names out of history books, because what does it matter who did anything as long as things happened? Frankly, it looks to me like the people who say, what does it matter who wrote them as long as we have them, are inadvertently revealing their own doubts about their own position, or at least are hedging their bets in case some inconvenient document shows up in an archive somewhere. Oh, sorry, but by the way, I can't help noticing that the people who say, what does it matter who wrote them, somehow always manage to put their own names and biographies in their own articles and books.
Bravo to you, Jonathan Dixon. I want to say thank you to everyone who entered this year's video contest and to the thousands of people who watched the final videos online and voted. Clearly, the authorship word is spreading through our video contest. Now, before we close this year's conference, we have two special awards to make. The announcement of the second Tom Regnier Veritas Award. And for that, I would like to call upon Professor Roger Stritmatter. Roger.
Thank you, Don. I am gratified to accept this award on behalf of my longtime friend and collaborator, Lynn Kazitsky, a gifted historical novelist whose deep contributions to the Oxfordian movement are yet to achieve their full recognition. I'd like to read to you Lynn's response to learning of being awarded with this honor. She wrote, "Dear Tom, we are so sorry that you're no longer with us, not only because you were such a wonderful lawyer, not only because you chose to share with us your extraordinary lectures, writing, and acting, but because we are now deprived of your inspiring presence. We shall not look upon your like again. This award means more to me than anything I could have wished for. My deep gratitude to John Hamill, the Board of Trustees, and everyone else involved in thinking of me and honoring me with this unlooked for but very special award." That, by the way, is Lynn in about 1996 in British Columbia, visiting Joe and Ian Haste, for any who remember them. Kazitsky's 2000 young adult novel, A Question of Will, features a 13-year-old protagonist who time travels back to a gritty London circa 1598. Disguised as a boy who plays female parts on the stage, Willow eventually ferrets out the truth of Shakespearean authorship. And I'd like to read you a short excerpt here. "It was futile to be freaked. More importantly, if I was about to be thrown on the scrap heap, I had things to do and say that just had to be done and said. I've fathomed your secret, sir," I repeated firmly, back on track. And I believe you're making a major mistake. And you would know. Vere paused briefly. I never tried to hide the truth from you, Willow. I understood from the outset you had wit enough to work out the whys and wherefores. My nickname, Shakespeare, given me at court, was similar to your master's surname. He started to pinch the plaudits meant for me, and I was delighted. Borrowed him for a front man. In fact, paid him handsomely to quiet the queen's ire. She doesn't like it known. Her courtiers scratch out their livings with the quill. Nothing remarkable about that. I still say you've made a major mistake, sir. His features dark and shadows hacking into the hollows of his cheeks. Suddenly he looked horribly forbidding. Listen to the kitten minding the cap how to lap milk, he hissed. Picking up his pen, he turned his attention back to his work. I'm sorry, sir, but you have to listen. There isn't much time. I am delighted that Lynn has achieved this richly rewarded honor. And I'd like to read you from the book that we wrote together on the Tempest. In our conclusion, we wrote, we are confident that the reflexive argument that Oxford cannot have been the author of the Tempest due to the chronology question is rapidly becoming obsolete. Let's give a round of virtual applause for our distinguished colleague, Lynn Kazitsky. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger, and bravo to Lynn, another Canadian Oxfordian, one of our inspirations in Canada. Well deserved, and thank you so much for doing that, Roger, and for saying those things. To announce the winner of this year's Oxfordian of the Year, I would like to call on 2019 Oxfordian of the Year, Cheryl Eagan-Donovan, and 2020 winner, James Warren. Cheryl, Jim.
Thank you, John. As chair of the SOF Oxfordian of the Year Selection Committee, I'm very pleased to announce that although this year's decision was made especially difficult by both the number of worthy candidates put forward and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on many activities during the past year, the committee was unanimous in its final decision. And to announce the recipient of the 2021 award, I'd like to welcome back 2020 Oxfordian of the Year, Jim Warren.
All right, well, I'm very pleased that it has fallen to me to announce the award for the Oxfordian of the Year for 2021. As Cheryl has noted, the selection committee considered the contributions of many people before ultimately and unanimously agreeing that the person who had made the most outstanding contributions to advancing the Oxfordian cause over recent years is Dr. Richard Waugaman. We all agree that Dr. Waugaman, or Rick as he is known to his many Oxfordian friends, has achieved much in both of the fellowship's priority areas. His research has significantly strengthened the Oxfordian claim to authorship of Shakespeare's works, and his outreach or promotion of the Oxfordian idea has been extensive and effective in broadening awareness of the Oxfordian claim. Rick's tireless work over so many years has truly advanced the mission of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. As an example of the important findings his research has produced, consider his work on the Psalms. He documented that Shakespeare, in drawing on the Psalms, relied not on the translation in the Geneva Bible, his main biblical source, but on the now obscure translation known as the Whole Book of Psalms. A copy of that work is bound together with Edward de Vere's copy of the Geneva Bible, now in the Folger Shakespeare Library, thus providing another strong link between Edward de Vere and the work known as Shakespeare's. The prestigious journal, academic journal, Notes and Queries, was so impressed by this finding that it published Rick's lengthy article on the subject. Notes and Queries runs mostly shorter pieces. That it requested and ran Rick's lengthy article shows just how important the publication regarded his discovery. One of the most astonishing aspects of Rick's Shakespeare work is his productivity. The sheer number of pieces he has published, nearly 100 pieces over the past 18 years, is more than impressive. His work includes scores of articles and 2 ebooks, It's Time to Revere Shakespeare, and newly discovered works by William Shakespeare, AKA Edward de Vere. Some of his longer pieces have appeared as chapters in books. Equally impressive and almost unprecedented is that dozens of his pieces have appeared in non-Oxfordian publications. He has spread awareness of the Oxfordian idea and the insights it gives into Shakespeare's works far and wide. Dr. Richard Waugaman is clinical professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University. He has combined his professional activities in that field with his expertise in matters Shakespearean to place articles on that subject in many top psychiatric journals, including Psychiatry, Psychoanalysis, and the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Not since the days of Bronson Feldman, more than half a century ago, has anyone promoted awareness of Edward de Vere as Shakespeare so extensively in the field of psychology. I could go on and on about Rick's accomplishments, about his pieces in Renaissance publications and elsewhere that reach a variety of other important audiences not well acquainted with the Oxfordian idea, but time is short. Rick once noted that Oxfordians are in trouble not because we don't know how to notice evidence, but because we routinely notice evidence that Stratfordians have agreed to completely ignore. So, for strengthening rather than ignoring that evidence, and for making it harder for Orthodox scholars to continue to ignore it, Rick is highly deserving of the distinction of being named Oxfordian of the Year for 2021. Congratulations, Rick. And Rick, if you'd like to say a few words, I think we have some time available for you.
Thanks so much. This is a wonderful surprise. And thanks for having looked into stuff as thoroughly as you did. Gee, you really looked at a lot of things to say all that. So thank you so much, Jim and Cheryl and the committee. And I always want to cite the New York Times article in 2002 about Roger Stritmatter's PhD dissertation, because I don't think it still has gotten the recognition it deserves. I had known that Freud thought Oxford was Shakespeare, and I knew he was wrong until I read that New York Times article. And what was so exciting about it was that Roger had found extremely significant evidence. And I can see why the Stratfordians have ignored his work. So I always like to single out Roger's influence, but I've known so many wonderful Oxfordians, and thank you so much. And I'm grateful to the committee and to the organization. Thanks.
Congratulations, Rick. Bravo. Before we end, let me thank everyone on the conference committee who's worked so hard to make this event happen, with a very special thank you to our technical director, Jennifer Newton. And thanks to all of you for being with us via Zoom. The SOF board is discussing another symposium like this in the spring. Keep an eye out for details. And with a little luck, we'll be able to resume our in-person annual conferences a year from now in Ashland, Oregon. We look forward to seeing you again online and or in person in 2022. And if we don't meet before then, let me be the first to wish you a happy New Year and a happy Thanksgiving. That's this weekend for our Canadian friends. This is Don Rubin for the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship saying over and out. And please remember what I think should be our motto, de Vere, de Bard.